Jack.
Levi.
The Book Club from Hell.
Hello everyone, this is Jack with the Book Club from Hell, capital's most potent organ of enclosing, commodifying and selling any form of anti-capitalist action. This week's episode is on Capitalist Realism by Mark Fisher. Mark Fisher, born in 1968, was an English philosopher, teacher, blogger and writer, among many other things. He was a founding member of the Cybernetic Culture Research Unit at the University of Warwick, working with people such as Sadie Plant and Nick Land, and was friends with the producer Code 9. He started the K-Punk blog in 2003, writing about music, film, culture, depression, and basically anything else he found interesting or relevant. Tragically, Fisher killed himself in 2017 at the age of 48, leaving behind a wife and child. Capitalist Realism was published in 2009 through Zero Books, a publisher which Fisher co-founded. Capitalist Realism is, in short, about the sense that there is no alternative to capitalism, the sense that culture has stagnated and that, whatever misgivings we may have, the future's trajectory will be a continuation of that which prevailed in the 2000s. Fisher expected Capitalist Realism to be only a minor work. He stated that he'd be happy if it sold 500 copies. It went on to sell over 100,000 copies, gaining traction largely through word of mouth and influencing anti-capitalist movements across the whole world. On the subject of capitalism, if you like what we're doing with this podcast and want to support us, we have a Patreon account, the link to which is in the show notes. People on Patreon can access the notes I make for episodes, so long as that episode warrants coherent notes, and we also release bonus content, bonus episodes for people who want to pay us on Patreon, really. As well as that, I've published a novel called Tower, a surreal, absurd journey involving the medical treatment of souls, a tower who remakes the world in its image, amphetamines, and a talking hat. You can find Tower on Amazon or on Apple Books, the links to which are in the show notes. So, if you're ready to tear a hole in the grey curtain of reaction, then listen on. Enjoy. So this is a book that we've had requested a number of times, actually, and having read it, I can now see why. Because both Levi and I have made it very clear that, I think at several points, basically in every episode, that we like many aspects of capitalism. And it'll be interesting, actually, before we start really getting into the meat of what capitalist realism is, to say what we think capitalism is and what we think Mark Fisher, in discussing capitalist realism, thought capitalism was.
Yeah.
Because how people define capitalism, in the same way as how people define socialism or communism, for example, tends to be quite variant. There's not really a single definition that people like to.
And you need to,
settle on.
at least for the purpose of any particular conversation, make sure you're talking about the same thing.
Yeah, and many heated arguments over these various. Exactly. Many of these heated arguments over these systems, oftentimes people just be arguing completely different things. Like their definitions.
So we'll try to get on the same page.
Yeah.
As Mark. So yeah, it's interesting. So anti-capitalist book.
Sorry, go on.
Yeah, so I was going to say, it's an anti-capitalist book, and if anybody's listened to our like Ayn Rand Atlas Shrugged episode, or our
Sovereign Individual
or Rothbard episode, you just like know how much Levi likes that sort of masturbatory libertarianism. So yeah, it's good to read something. And also I think like our previous anti-capitalist books haven't necessarily been that serious. Man, I'm all blocked up today. Sorry.
In terms of serious ones, so the Conquest of Bread was at least written seriously. It's a sort of thing where really outside left anarchist circles, people don't take it particularly seriously. So Marxists don't take it particularly seriously. Capitalists don't take it particularly seriously. But that was Conquest of Bread by Kropotkin was written seriously.
And the
Xenofeminist Manifesto was written seriously.
Yeah, but I guess how seriously I would take it as a set of ideas.
Yeah, less seriously. There were central ideas in it that I thought were really interesting, like this idea of if nature has allotted biological women certain physical characteristics that make them oppressed, then change nature. I thought that was a really cool idea and actually a new perspective, but in terms of things that are directly addressed against capitalism, capitalist realism is the most compelling that I've read, at least for this podcast.
Yeah. Yeah. So, what was your attitude going into the book, Jack?
I was not feeling charitable to the book going into it because, like, I've spent far too long at university in my life, and I've come across many
Andrew
people
Tate
who
would
are.
reprimand you for that.
Yeah, he would reprimand me for a large number of things in his funny British American accent. But I've come across a lot of people who proclaim to be anti-capitalist, who are actually quite well described by Mark Fisher in this book and also in other essays of his that I read on the basis of having enjoyed capitalist realism, such as Exit from the Vampire Castle. He describes them as being, it's a puritanical left or a sanctimonious left, the people who actually live in a way that fully supports capitalism, and instead of organizing to structurally change capitalism, they instead focus on games of status and of public moral purity, and a lot of scolding each other and other people for not behaving according to a set of quite prescriptive moral norms that they like. So I've had a lot of contact with those sort of people, and those sort of people have poisoned for me the notion of being anti-capitalist, because they'll often very, very publicly identify themselves with being anti-capitalist. And I unfairly lumped in Fisher's capitalist realism with that group of people, and that's on me. And he's not part of that. He, at various points during his life, agitated against the left, at least in the United Kingdom, becoming dominated by what he saw as, in the main, quite wealthy, middle class or upper class, university educated leftists who are much more interested in this sort of public leftist moralizing rather than what he saw as the role of the left, which was organizing the working classes such that they could overcome capitalism. So his project I find much more compelling, actually. And yeah, my biases against this book going in were unfounded and reflect my own prejudices rather than the quality of this book. How about you? How did you feel going into it?
Yeah, I would say maybe not as hostile as you. I don't know why. Like, when you suggested the book, one, I think it's got a cool title. Like, Capitalist Realism just sounds like a cool title. And then I don't know. Can you hear that chopper in the back? Is that coming through? Should I close?
Every now and then, yeah. Maybe close your window.
Damn. Okay. Give me.
No, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Just keep going. Okay.
Get to the chopper.
Get to the chopper.
It's probably like an ambulance chopper. So I hope they're okay whoever they are.
The capitalist realist police have realised that we're about to discuss how to exit capitalist realism. We're about to swat Levi.
Yeah. So I went in, I think, a little bit, not necessarily more charitable, I was just interested to see what it was. Like, cool title and it had an interesting subtitle, like, is there really no alternative? Yeah. It's like, oh, that's interesting. That's an interesting premise for a book. And I guess I have been thinking a lot recently about actually reflecting on this podcast, like when we've done like non-capitalist or anti-capitalist or whatever positions, I just thought, like, I didn't really take them seriously enough, did I? Like, to be honest. And then when we had, like the Rothbard episode or whatever, I was just like, like, I'll try to be a bit more like flexible in my thinking rather than just like
not just glazing Rothbard.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, trying to update. So it was actually like well timed. There's another book that we've been recommended for some anti-capitalist stuff as well that I think is on the reading list somewhere.
Which one?
I'll say, I can't remember. I'll see if I can, like, well, I won't look at it now because it's just distracting. But yeah, there'll be stuff. And I've been interested in reading, I haven't bought it yet. Oh, I just bought it then when we were getting ready for the show. But there's this book, Capitalism and Schizophrenia. I think it's called Anti-Oedipus by Deleuze and what's his name?
Guattari.
Yeah, Guattari, who influenced Mark Fisher. And Yeah, I've been meaning to read that book for a while because one of my friends is like a really big Deleuze fan. So okay, cool.
Yeah, I've
so
got
I was
both volumes of that on my bookshelf, and I've been too scared to start them because they're so dense. It's just fucked.
yeah, so I went in a little bit kind of more willing to, or like more open to reading anti-capitalist stuff than I have in the past. Yeah, because I think if you're actually going to hold a position, like, you know, especially if we're doing this sort of podcast when we're putting our thoughts out there and stuff, and we like capitalism, we should be able to like actually, you know, engage with the alternative ideas and stuff. I think that's important.
Yeah, this was a good corrective for me to make me just take a step back and stop being such a jackass.
So on that note, before we move on to the context of the book, how has your view of the book changed at a high level now before we jump into the rest of the episode?
Yeah, well, my view of the book is much more reflective of what the book is actually about.
That helps. That helps a lot.
It's a really nice book. It's very short. My edition's 80.
You always get points in Jack's book if you're short.
Pages. It's not so much being short, it's not wasting time that I care about more. And Fisher really doesn't waste time in this book. There's one chapter, the one on dream work, that I found less compelling. But even that, it wasn't a waste of time. So it's really to the point. It brings up real problems and the sense that there is no alternative is definitely something that I've felt. And so it was really interesting to have that feeling verbalized by someone else at length. And then both discussed as how this feeling of there being no alternative can arise, as well as possible exits, and begging the question, do you want to exit? If you do want to exit, how do you do that within a system that at least seems to commodify every attempt to subvert it, and in commodifying it, integrate it into the system of capitalism and capitalist realism? So I'm much more interested in reading more anti-capitalist literature in the vein of Mark Fisher. I have already read more things by Mark Fisher on the strength of capitalist realism. And while I've been largely because of Nick Land wanting to read more Deleuze, because I read I think it's Postscript on the Societies of Control by Deleuze because it was referenced in Capitalist Realism. But I'll probably take the plunge on Deleuze and Guattari at some point soon. One of their more substantial works, having read this.
Is it worth considering doing it for the show?
I'm not so sure, because it would be a time investment to the point where I doubt we could do weekly uploads if we were reading that.
Okay. Sure.
Because it's a lot worse than Spengler in terms of difficulty.
Oh no, far out.
And then there's the length of it. And also there's a great deal of discussion of capitalism and schizophrenia, for example. And so I guess, you know...
Oh yeah, fair. Actually,
the question is, what would we be adding to it as two people
nothing. We wouldn't be
just like
anything.
dilettantes when it comes to this sort of thing. I suppose for a certain type, the comedy of us struggling through it might be engaging enough, but for most, it's probably not sufficient.
Look at these two monkeys trying to read Deleuze. Yeah, nice one. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Well,
actually, how has your view of the anti-capitalist landscape changed, or has it changed on the basis of reading this book?
Yeah, it has. You know, when I was younger, I just even say like on this podcast a couple of years ago, like, or throughout, you know, the last couple of years, I'm trying to be more, as I said before, like flexible in the way that I think about alternative points of view. And I guess overall, my feeling is that he makes some really interesting points. And I think, like, in general, anti-capitalist people they've got some really interesting points and point out really, at times, really important problems. And I think that's valuable. And, you know, like sometimes I think some of the things that they think are problems are not really problems, but, you know, that's sort of not as important. They're trying to find they've got these criticisms, and it's good to listen to them. And Yeah, I guess I feel as though there's some pretty substantial misunderstandings that Mark Fisher had, and it seems as though like other people in his tradition also have. I think, and that leads him like down kind of intellectual garden paths that I think like they have, for whatever reason, they haven't picked up. I think I know why they haven't picked it up, but like. Yeah, so that's yeah, it's interesting, and I'm a little bit more open to it, and especially because Mark Fisher's a good writer, and
He writes very clearly.
he's not like other people in his tradition, in that kind of school of philosophers like Deleuze and stuff, who are notorious for being just impenetrable. There's one of the guys who's one of the other major, not Zizek, one of the other major philosophers that he keeps on referencing. He's like he wrote this book called sorry, I'm really like blocked, like
Very
phlegmy.
phlegmy
Yeah,
today.
sorry, I'll try and drink some more water. He wrote this book about like postmodernism as the culture of capitalism.
Oh, Frederick Jameson.
Yeah, and I downloaded that book. Or
I want to read that book.
and I started and I only read one paragraph, and I was just like, "This is fucking ridiculous! Like, this is absolutely impenetrable. There's no way that this guy is writing for a general audience or anything like this. This is just this is just for other philosophers in his school."
There is a certain prose style of continental philosophers and people in the Anglosphere who like continental philosophers, and it does seem intentionally obscure, and I find it extremely irritating.
Yeah, whereas as Mark Fisher, he had a little bit of that. Like there was some moments I was like, okay, like you're writing in a way that's like other people, like you really have to have like already sort of like bought the Kool-Aid and like read some of the other philosophers and stuff, and without some of that background knowledge, it was a little bit. But like for the most part, he didn't do that. Not like some of the other people in from those sorts of like schools of philosophy. He was largely a very accessible writer, and I think that partly explains why this was a massive success of a book.
It was a huge success.
Like a huge success. Like was it? He sold like 20,000 copies or something. Like in the first
I think
year or so,
that. I'll
or 100,000, something. Like just the timing of it and the accessibility of the writing. And he already had a bit of a blog going, so he had
over 100,000 sales in English alone.
And so yeah, like it was a massive success. A really interesting book,
and largely word of mouth. And published through a publishing house, Zero Books, that he co-founded.
Yeah, that's super impressive. So it's super impressive. Like, really cool. And yeah, really interesting and thought-provoking book, even if I still have my disagreements with kind of the fundamentals. But so my view is actually, he's brought me around a little bit to, if we'd read something else that was anti-capitalist, that was just like impenetrable, maybe it would have hardened my heart.
Yeah. Well, with it, it's interesting that you brought up the clarity of his writing, because I think that is an important part of the appeal of this book, because with many anti-capitalist authors who are influenced by continental philosophy, particularly French continental philosophy, I sometimes get the feeling that they are writing in an obscure way to cover up the fact that a lot of the things they're saying aren't actually particularly interesting. Whereas with Mark Fisher, like you said, he writes very, very clearly. And also when he brings in certain concepts like the big other or the real, that sort of thing, most of the time he will explain roughly what those things are and how they relate to his argument. So you don't have to keep stepping away from his book to look up terms and try to work out what he means. There are only a few times when he said things. I think it was particularly when he was critiquing Nick Land, which is a former colleague of his at the CCRU, the University of Warwick, when he was talking about how I think it's pure capitalism in the sense of Nick Land cannot exist because capitalism requires the re-territorializing tendencies and conspicuous waste, which I assume are things that Deleuze said at some point, but my knowledge of Deleuze is extremely poor, so I just don't know. And so when you read things like that, I think this actually hasn't clarified anything for me. But at the same time, he's done a really, really good job of integrating a large corpus of obscure work and then rendering it, for the most part, very, very accessible, which is a real achievement in itself.
Yeah, really impressive. So cool. That's our opening thoughts.
Yeah.
well, yeah, good. Opening thoughts. So when was the book published? 2009. All right, so we're going to get into
Yep.
context. So yeah, this book was published in 2009. So Mark Fisher's British. He was at the University of Warwick, and I believe he grew up in England, right? So
Yep.
and yeah, he published this book, but I think he must have been writing it for a while, like it's piecing together his thoughts like over more than just a year or so. But he published it in 2009, which was like peak of the financial crisis.
Yeah, it's the story of the book's interesting because he taught, I think he taught philosophy. He wrote a lot of more technical works, and he co-founded, I forget with whom, Zero Books, a publishing house, because he was having trouble getting stuff published. Because he's been, at least when it comes to what he described as in I think his essay, Exit from the Vampire Castle, The Sanctimonious Left, he's been very critical of them, and they've largely been dominant in university leftist circles. So he was kind of on the outside. So a kind of cool way to get published, co-founded a publishing house, which I have a lot of respect for.
And then sell 100,000 copies of a book. That's pretty baller.
I think he was wanting to write something longer and more in-depth than Capitalist Realism. And initially, I think his editors and the other people at the publishing house were a bit miffed that he presented to them this 80-page manuscript, something really, really short. And he wasn't convinced that it was going to be particularly successful. He was very, very doubtful that it would do well. And it ended up striking a chord and selling really well, largely through word of mouth, because this wasn't a huge publishing house with a lot of advertising resources at its disposal. And it was just after the global financial crisis, or when the global financial crisis was still really hurting, during austerity, in the United Kingdom, New Labour under Tony Blair and subsequently Gordon Brown. I forget when Gordon Brown replaced Blair, but it was at a time when people like Fisher on the left felt very, very disillusioned because, to his mind, the Labour Party had become almost the most neoliberal party in the United Kingdom, which is not unreasonable. New Labour was quite neoliberal and instituted or deepened a lot of the things that in this book he identifies as real issues with neoliberalism, like the constant PR machine of auditing for self-surveillance, for example, in education and healthcare. At that time too, there was, and having, for the Zoomers out there who don't remember the GFC, that there was a feeling in the lead up to it that we'd kind of got it. There wouldn't be major changes from how the world was currently run, that it seemed this was how it was going to be. I think there was a widespread feeling of that, at least in the West. And even after the GFC, and probably up until the mid-2010s, the Trump changed things, I think. There was the feeling that even if you didn't particularly like how things were going, this increasingly bureaucratized state interventionist capitalism, that was just how things were going to be, because that was what was realistic and efficient, and it would outcompete other things, and you couldn't really escape from that. And there was that sense of cultural deadening, which was the milieu into which this book was published and under which this book was written. While I think things have changed, there is a greater sense now that things could change, although the shape of that change is less clear. The book, I think, is still relevant, but certain things in the book feel of their time, of 2009.
Yeah, and it seems as though he was also speaking quite, obviously because he's British, and a lot of the topics that he references are about British politics and like the British higher education system and so forth. I think he was speaking as well to like the cultural climate of England in particular,
Yeah.
which might have been a bit different, say, in other Western countries. Yeah, because there was also things like the Occupy movement and stuff that came out around that
Yeah.
time, which was like a bit more anarchist and stuff. So yeah, really interesting context. And yeah, it just goes to show, like, I mean, his book sales speak for himself as an unknown
Yeah,
author.
and it's still selling.
And people still talk about it. And at least in the copy that I've got, it's got, I assume that you've got the same copy, but it's got this foreword, I think, or an introduction by one of his colleagues, or somebody who read it.
One is his wife also,
and his wife, and
right? Yeah,
but in
yeah,
particular, like the other person who's not his wife, like a colleague or whatever, who read it, who said they had this profound sense of, I don't know what the right word would be, like alienation or whatever, and but didn't have necessarily an explanatory framework or whatever to make sense of it. And then when he read Capitalist Realism, it gave him, it helped him make sense in his telling, or in his perspective. And obviously, I think if you also go and look at like stuff online, people discussing it, seems to have hit a thread. Hit a nerve with people, and yeah, apparently people find it really compelling.
Yeah, which is often how these sort of really, really influential books work, that there are these latent energies that aren't verbalized or aren't particularly precise, that are widespread. And eventually someone is able to verbalize or make more explicit those latent energies, and it catches on. And I think that is what happened with Capitalist Realism.
So,
because like you said, people are still talking about it. People are still asking us to talk about it.
Yeah. So just before we move on to definitions, so Jack and I thought that it'd be good at the start to talk a little bit about definitions. So about like what is capitalism, that sort of stuff. But just before we get into that, while I was reading it, Jack, I thought that you might find it really interesting. So anybody who's read Jack's book, Tower by Jack BC, get it on, I don't know,
Amazon.
Is it on a bookshed or anything? Or anyways,
I should do iBooks. It's on Amazon and iBooks.
Okay, so go to Jack BC. Is it jackbc.me or something? Yeah.
Jack BC. www.jackbc.me.
And by Tower, you'll notice that
JACKBC.me.
That's Jack before Christ. He is the Holy Spirit.
Jack Book Club.
You can also call him Father Abraham.
That is my name.
Jack or Father Abraham are acceptable.
Yeah.
So, anyways, like Jack's book has, I would say there's if not an anti-capitalist thread to it, definitely a capitalist critical undertone to it. And yeah, because you've been thinking about this like technological capitalist stuff for a bit. And yeah, I thought, did you have any, did it make you think about your own writing much, reading this particular concept?
Yeah, a lot.
Yeah.
So it's a combination of writing Tower, reading Thirst for Annihilation at the moment by Nick Land. And Nick Land was a colleague of Mark Fisher's in the CCRU. And you can really see that the two of them knew each other, had worked together, had talked to each other, because there are a lot of similar preoccupations in this book, particularly exit. And what Nick Land means by, or exit from what in the context of Nick Land, is different from that of Mark Fisher. Mark Fisher is much more tied to human beings than Nick Land.
yeah.
Perhaps a little more practical as well, but both of them are reacting to this sense of, it's still something that I think of as technique, of a collection of standardized behaviors that lead to standardized outputs with the goal of optimizing for efficiency, and of ultimate efficiency being the end point. And that I keep bringing up Jacques Ellul because that was the first place where I came across this idea of technique. Tower was very much written as me thinking about technique, and a lot of what Fisher talks about in Capitalist Realism I see as addressing technique. So, for example, when we talk about market Stalinism, which might be my favorite concept in this book, it's that it is such a useful concept that I've already used it internally to think about things. This idea of producing almost a lowest or a local minimum of an energetic state in a system, optimizing for efficiency, that leads to these really strange situations where no one within the system likes it, but everyone is almost compelled to behave in a way as to promote the system's survival because of a set of local incentives and local circumstances, struck me as highly technical. And so I suppose that's where maybe where you see the intersection between Fisher's anti-capitalism and my nervousness about the advance of technique being.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, cool. That's super interesting. Like maybe maybe we'll see some of the concepts from this book in your subsequent writings.
Subsequent
Yeah,
writing.
yeah, we'll see. Okay, so definitions, hey? Why don't we get into it?
Yeah.
So before we can really say like what is capitalist realism, obviously that's a very important thing. We sort of thought that it would be good to talk just a little bit more about capitalism and make sure that we're at least, even if we get it wrong and actually like Mark Fisher's ideas of what capitalism are actually different to what we're about to describe, at least we've made an attempt to try to like say what we think his understanding is. So we're not like accidentally talking past him. So Jack, what is should we say like what is your understanding? What is, should we start with the Marxist understanding, or like what do you reckon, or just the general?
Might start off with the Marxist definition of capitalism first,
cool.
because that's what when I read this book, this was my assumption as to what Fisher meant when he talked about capitalism and capital C, capital. That he was referring to the Marxist definition. I had to revise this because I read Capital maybe a decade ago, so I couldn't remember off the top of my head the precise definition, and I might get it wrong. Shout out to Moog, who will correct us on the Discord if we do miss Marxist these definitions. But when Fisher talks about capitalism and capital, the Marxist definition, which I assume he was following, is that. So first, no, we talk about capital. So capital is the accumulation of money and can't arise in history until the circulation of commodities has given rise to the money relation. And now there are a few definitions here that I should lay out so that this makes sense, and also so that capitalist realism makes sense. So first of all, maybe the difference between money as capital and money as money is really in the circulation of the money, how the money circulates. Money is simply money when it's used to facilitate the exchange of commodities. Money becomes capital when it's used to buy something in order to sell it again. And as such, capitalism isn't just wealth, but it's this wealth that grows from the process of its circulation.
Yeah.
You also need, there are a few conditions that need to be met for wealth to become capital, or money to become capital. So people need to be able to produce more than they need to live as a result of the development of the forces of production. And this lets them have surplus labor left over each day after they've worked to produce that amount that they would need to live. And at which, presumably, if there weren't a capitalist system, they'd just stop producing because they don't need to make more stuff. So there also has to be this class of free laborers who've got nothing to sell but their ability to work, and they don't have another way to earn a living. And this is the proletariat. You also need a class of people who own the means of production as private property, the bourgeoisie, and these are the people who are able to take that surplus labor that the proletariat undertakes, that labor beyond which they would normally work to fulfill their own needs. And the capitalists kind of skimming wealth off the top of that, which is accumulating capital. In this, I've used the term commodity a few times, and this is really important in the Marxist definition of capitalism, and it's important too in capitalist realism, because particularly in the first, maybe third of the book, he talks about the capitalist drive to just keep commodifying things, which leads to a lot of the desacralization, the ironization of everything, the lack of reverence in anything, because everything's getting flattened into this fungible commodity state. So a commodity is something that's produced for the purposes of exchanging it for something else. And I think, and Marxist in the audience, please correct me if I'm wrong on this, it's also something that satisfies a human want. So labor exchange to meet someone else's needs in order that the laborer can then meet their own needs, that is, in return for a payment, is a commodity. A good or a service performed by a person for their own immediate consumption is not a commodity. So if you're working, you make something and it's just for you, that's not a commodity. If you make it such that you exchange it with someone else, that they give you something in return, and that something is something you need to live, then it becomes a commodity. And so note that if someone makes something for someone else in order to satisfy that other person's needs, but not to satisfy their own needs, then it's not a commodity. For example, like cooking or cleaning for a loved one, like that cooking or cleaning labor is not a commodity. It's not like you're doing it for the other person such that they give you stuff that you satisfy your needs. You're doing it just for that person because you love them or you care for them, something like that. This then brings us to, finally, I've taken a while to lead up to this, the definition of capitalism. So capitalism is a socioeconomic system where the social relations between people are based on commodities for exchange. That is, private ownership of the means of production and using wage labor to fuel fuel production of commodities, which generates capital, which accumulates for capitalists, immiserating the proletariat.
Yeah, and importantly as well, there's the important function of like the money. What do you say? It's like is wage labor, but just to unpack wage a little bit more. There's this important concept of like that being based on like a money that you're paying the labor in. Yeah, obviously from wage. Yeah, I think those were some of the key points. I think you covered everything.
I mean, I hope I have it. I had to revise this because my Marxist knowledge is rusty and I'm liable to make mistakes. So I hope I did at least a high level view of the Marxist definitions of capitalism, commodities. And probably capitalism, and commodities are the three Marxist definitions that are really useful in understanding where Fisher's coming from in capitalist realism.
So there's one other important point that I'll add to that. I think we've pretty much covered everything that's important, but one other thing in that sphere of ideas is that there's a problem of like, why do people give up one thing to get another thing? Whether it's giving up labor to get some money, or selling a commodity to get some money, or trading one commodity for another commodity, or whatever.
If you could deliver this in an Austrian accent.
I'm not going to try and do an Austrian accent. just every time I try to do accents, it's just terrible. So yeah, just those days are over. Yeah, so it's sometimes described as the water diamond paradox. Like, why is water, because it's it's so essential, but it's so cheap in a place like London or whatever, but yet diamonds are not essential, but they're so expensive. And lots of economists tried to deal with this. Even Smith was trying to think through this stuff, and Smith came up with what's called what I call, I don't know if other people call it, but I call it the input theory of value. So where does something get its value from? It gets it from its inputs. It's like the cost of production. And then, I don't know, maybe the seller or the producer adds some margin to it, and then you get the price. And in Smith was thinking that like the market is essentially like some kind of a computation, to use a modern way of phrasing these things, like a computation that's trying to find the objective, true value of something. And it's this idea of like value versus price. Basically, they're trying to figure like what's the difference between value and price. One of the important concepts that Marx had, and again, apology to all the Marxists in the audience if
I think I know where you're going. And I totally forgot to bring this up.
I'm not going to like talk about like my disagreements or anything with that. I'll just try to is this idea of like equivalence relations. So like Marx, in Marx's opinion, or in Marx's description, you exchange one thing for another because at least you perceive those things as equivalent in value. And then I don't know, like I want to read too much into it because I'd have to like go back and like double up on like reading and everything, like to get my concepts right. But like,
Just read Capital.
yeah, I need to like, I try to read it every now and then, get a little bit through it, and I go, oh, fuck this.
It's a big commitment.
Yeah, it's a big commitment. But that equivalence relation thing is like important because it feeds into like, well, you know, if a capitalist is selling something for $20, but he only paid labor and cost of production stuff for $10, then like, and there's the equivalence relationships between all the inputs, then the extra price that he's charging is like value added that he's scraping off the top and taking away from the workers or whatever. So there's this idea of equivalence relations, and yeah, I think that's probably the other major important point that I think is to highlight that idea.
I should also say it within all this, at least I'm not sure if Fisher subscribed to this or not. Because this is a book intended for the public. And it was meant to be short, it was meant to be very, very accessible. It makes a lot of sense why he chose to maybe not spend the first half of the book just nailing down his definitions of things. I think that was the right choice.
Yeah, but given his...
in terms of like the labor theory of value, I was just going to say Marx felt that the true value of things sold comes from the labor expended to make them. So other things like, say, capital expenditure on machinery doesn't come into it. Like that's not a necessarily valid.
Or more specifically, thing. It's just a recursive argument. So it's like, yeah, but where did that like factor of production get its value from? Well, it had to be made by somebody or something. So it's like you just recursively go backwards far enough into the production chain. Eventually, you'll get to like basically land and labor. And obviously, in order to get anything productive out of land, you have to like apply labor to it to transform the resource. So at the end of the day, it just comes down to labor.
Yeah. And I'll put an asterisk there as to, I'm not sure if that's what Fisher believed or not.
Yeah.
Because it's not made clear in this book. Whereas other things like the Marxist definition of capital, for example, while Fisher doesn't explicitly say, this is what I think capital is, the book makes a lot of sense when read with that definition of capital.
But also to be fair, given his influences, like Zizek, Deleuze and stuff, they're kind of post-Marxian like philosophers. You know, even I think like Zizek is generally described as a neo-Marxian or something like that, you know. So if that's not exactly his understanding of capitalism, I think I'm okay just assuming that it is roughly his. Maybe he has a more pervasive idea of. I think he has a more pervasive idea of capitalism around like its cultural stuff and whatever. But those are some of the basic things that we can work with. And if we're wrong, if we go and read some more Mark Fisher in the future and we find a definition that he's actually thinking something slightly different, then whatever.
We'll do an episode on that.
Yeah, cool.
I will retract nothing. I've learned enough from the Tate Bible to know that I should never ever apologize, never retract anything.
Yeah, well, I guess if you want to be the leader of the free world or the most famous person on the internet, that's a good strategy.
Like Andrew Tate.
Like Andrew Tate.
That is exactly that is what I'm maximizing for. That's what I'm optimizing for by talking about Mark Fisher's Capitalist Realism, an obscure podcast.
Yeah, so I guess let's not spend too long on it, but at least...
How would you define capitalism?
Can I ask you the same question? It's almost as if we structured this podcast.
It's almost as if we've got the same episode structure written out for both of us in the same notion.
Yeah, interestingly enough, I think, you know, a lot of those things in the Marxist, like what we just described, I don't necessarily like the stuff around the equivalence relations, which I think they got wrong, that I don't think there's an objective value to anything. So I've already described like the Austrian view on previous episodes. But roughly speaking, like there's no objective value to it. Like valuation is a process that's performed by the people engaging in the exchange. It's subjective. And both of them get what they want more than what they're giving up. And yeah, so it's like it's not a big deal. it's actually,
which really interestingly at the end of this book in the Marxist super nanny section, Fisher does talk about that in a really interesting
very
way.
Briefly, but he describes
he alludes.
He doesn't really address the Austrian perspective. He addresses like the kind of classical and neoclassical economists, which is fine, but I think the Austrians like figured it out. So anyways, like so like a lot of the things are interesting. So I guess like capitalism, I think at least, is fundamentally based on the idea of private property, and then to the degree that you have violent, like Hans Hopper, the Austrian,
the famous lover of democracy.
the lover of democracy. He had a very succinct definition of it. He's like, so like socialism is the institutional violation or violence against private property, and capitalism is not that, or at least the institutional protection, or at least not the institutional aggression against it. And sort of from this idea of like a private property, some people might choose to use their private property as consumption, like to consume. So just as but the example that I like is just like a banana. If you consume the banana directly, it's just something that you're using for consumption. But you could use it as a higher order production good in creating like a banana bread. And it's very simple. You can see that like you haven't consumed the banana directly, you've used it to create another product. And in doing that, you've changed whether it's a consumption good or a production good. And basically the larger, the more complex, and the longer the process of production is, the more complex like your production goods become. And capital in particular in a modern sense, because we've got money as a unit of account, we're able to abstract away like the details of like, well, we've got this factory, but you can also like do things like, well, what's the land value of the factory? What's its approximate market value? Like apply things like amortization and stuff. And so a capitalist society is one that is focused on, or facilitates the accumulation of capital, which is essentially like the deepening and increasing complexity of the production chain to increase productive output. But the core thing that you need for that to work is private ownership in general, and then obviously private ownership of the means of production. And I think, what about you? That's probably enough for me.
Yeah, you think about this much more than I do, and your definitions will be much more well thought out. Fairly basically, my idea of capitalism is the system in which there is private property, but a particular definition of private property. So not a private property that, for example, someone can use for their own consumption, but they're not allowed to exchange.
Yeah.
For example, I wouldn't regard as capitalism. It's the exchange, the ability to exchange private property freely or semi-freely. Like there are always going to be restrictions.
Yeah. And so
almost always there are going to be social mores, like I don't know, selling 3-year-olds kidneys on the black market or something like
stuff.
that.
Yeah. Regressive taxation. Not allowed to sell my kidneys on the black market. Yeah. So I guess we discussed this the other week in person. Like,
except but we were also heavily intoxicated.
Yes, Jack. So like at least as I explained before, but in my opinion, like what I described, this like the institutional protection of private property actually subsumes that, because private property implies that you have the right to also like do what you want with your private property, including exchange. Like that's one of the things that you can do. Exchange is extremely important.
But it's a really interesting thing to specify though when you're defining private property, because not everyone is going to say being able to exchange it means it's private property. I suppose someone could say like, oh, if you have a piece of land, you're not allowed to sell it, but you can live on it. Like, you do what you want
that's a good
on
point.
the land.
So it's an important enough part of a capitalist society that it's good to pull out.
You want to emphasize that you can sell your stuff if you want.
And then you can accumulate it. You can create a profit if you can like sell the thing for more than the money that you put in and all that sort of stuff. And like roughly speaking, an important point just before we move on to the other stuff that for me that like kind of really made it click. For me, when I was reading von Mises, I think it's von Mises, he was explaining, is like, okay, so what an entrepreneur does is like, they'll look at the factors of production that are available, whether it's labor or like factories or machines, or whatever, on the market, they're going to like buy those, get some investment or whatever, buy those, and then get their like whatever else they need to like create the end product, build the thing over a course of time, over some time, like a year, and then at the end of that production process, they're going to sell their output. And if the entrepreneur and the managers and the investors have invested in a project where at the end of doing that, they're selling things for less than what they actually bought them for, and they're making a loss, what they've essentially done is they've created a very sophisticated way of destroying society's resources, because like you bought stuff off the market for a price of, say, like total cost of like the factors of production and everything and all that, like $100, and at the end you're only able to sell it for $90. What you've just done is you've created a process where you've taken things off the market, and then you're not able to sell it back for the market, but back to the market for at least as much as it cost you to create. So you've destroyed. It's actually a destructive thing to run a non-profitable business. And obviously, like, it depends on the timeline. You can, if it's 10 years, you run for a loss of 5 years, and then you make it all back over the long run. But like, if you just run a business at a loss just indefinitely, you're actually just like you're taking like goods off the market and like making them less valuable, as indicated by the fact that you can't sell them back to society, like your transformed end products back to society at a price that like covers the input costs. And to me, it's like, oh, right, okay, that's actually like pretty straightforward then. It's very abstract, but we need to deal with this abstraction because we have like such a complex production system, like the production system of 6 billion people or whatever that are connected now through the internet, and like global production chains and all this, like just the millions and millions of different products and stuff that you can have. Like the only way to deal with that sort of complexity is through an abstraction. In this case, like the abstraction is money as a unit of account. So yeah, that's sort of like, that's one of the things that made the penny drop for me, at least. Which I think, like, I've never seen a Marxist or anti-capitalist person like engage with that idea of like, well, if we just run an organization at a loss, like what we're essentially doing is like destroying resources. It's not as direct as just like buying some stuff and setting it on fire, but it's like, it kind of is in a more abstract way.
So I know we've taken a while to go over definitions and things like that, but it will make, or I hope it will make, the rest of this episode much clearer as to where Levi and I are coming from, and our understanding of some of the terms that Fisher uses but doesn't explicitly define in this book, especially when talking about things like capitalism, because it's such a politically loaded term. And when you listen to any debate on capitalism, you're probably going to hear, if there are two people debating, you're going to hear three definitions of capitalism. It's good if we can just define what we're talking about and what we think that Fisher is talking about and why we think Fisher might be using these terms.
So, Jack, one caveat there is that I've noticed with people who are into like structuralism, post-structuralism, that sort of stuff, when they talk about capitalism, they mean that, but that's necessary, but it's not sufficient. And I think Fisher does this as well. There's almost like this other aspect to it, which is this like this kind of political, cultural thing, which I think we can discuss more like throughout the episode.
Because I don't think it's an unreasonable. So Fisher,
it becomes more than just this economic thing that we're talking about.
It
becomes like a social structure.
I don't think is an unreasonable assumption to make that the system of production in a society is going to influence the culture. And similarly, like I think it's a feedback loop. The two things influence each other, because also the culture of a society is going to really influence the economic. So suppose you have a culture which, say Islamic societies, where usury is very explicitly banned. Some Islamic banks like get around it by doing like loans which don't technically have interest, but the interest it's in there. Like, there's a difference in the amount of money, say, that you borrow and the amount that you pay back, but it's not interest, because that's haram. Somehow
it definitely shapes social relations for sure.
Putting aside like kind of technical solutions to holy problems, like
ironically, that's like a very
It's such a capitalist way of getting around.
Yeah, liturgic way of getting around. Is liturgic the right way to say it? Maybe it's the wrong word. Anyways,
I mean, it's not going to be liturgical in Islam.
yeah. Sorry, I may have thinking of the wrong word. Anyways, so the other definition, then, with that caveat out of the way, like the social relations and stuff, the cultural aspects of it. There was one other definition I wanted to chat about that I think is important. That I always get confused when people drop this word. Do you know what word I'm going to say, Jack? The most confusing word that comes out of these bloody people. Neoliberalism.
I have a suspicion that
it's neoliberalism. What the hell do these people mean by neoliberalism?
Yes.
Let's just like put that one down there as well, because that one comes out a lot.
How about we talk about how we
I don't even fucking know, man. Like, this just gets like you thrown around so much, man. I always got to double check.
So you have to distinguish between the neoliberalism as a signifier for the signified of boogeyman. It's a thing I don't like that is responsible for the aspects of modernity that I don't like. So if you've got a Catholic integralist or something talking about neoliberalism, they mean it's the antinomian, anti-clerical impulse that leads to teenage girls twerking on the internet or something like that. So one of the things they disapprove of, or people not taking the Sabbath seriously, the desacralizing impulse of the modern world. Whereas if you ask a Marxist what neoliberalism is, perhaps more unreflective ones will describe it as, it's the late stage of capitalism. It's the final stage of capitalism where everything is melted into the market. So there's neoliberalism as epithet, just something I don't like.
Yeah, that's good. As epithet, that's a good one.
Yeah,
for sure.
When I think of neoliberalism, describing more and then besides it as a term of opprobrium, then there are probably two components. There's the philosophical component, or at least what the stated aim of neoliberalism is, and then how it exists in practice, and what I think of when I think of neoliberalism. So I guess there's the philosophical idea of we are returning to classical economic liberalism, in that there will be less government interference. The government will be sort of the night watchman government, where it provides security. It has a monopoly on violence, both within its borders and preventing external violent threats. But besides that, it is going to let the market run. That, again, this is more an epithet rather than something considered. But people who talk about free market fundamentalists, it's something more in that sense. There's also the emphasis on globalization, free trade. I think there are a lot of progressive assumptions. So while it's not explicitly stated by people espousing neoliberalism, I think oftentimes there is the tacit assumption that history has a direction. It's in the direction of basically the liberal Anglosphere, and the entire Earth is magically going to look more and more and more like, say, New York or certain parts of California.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, of course, the Bay Area. Yeah.
And then, hopefully not. And then there's the neoliberalism in practice. And this is what I think of when I think of neoliberalism, and what I intend when I describe something as neoliberalism. So it's a soft authoritarian form of government which takes certain Western values and then universalizes them through means such as free trade, pressuring other countries to open up their markets to Western goods, and a model of, I guess, PR free market, but one that is highly regulated by an ever-expanding government which runs ever larger budget deficits in order largely to fund social programs, and one that does so, or one that regulates the market largely through a centralist bureaucracy. And I was quite happy when Mark Fisher started talking about market Stalinism, which we'll go into more detail on, because to my mind, market Stalinism is one of the most important aspects of what I think of as neoliberalism, or at least neoliberalism in practice, because there is a big distinction to be drawn between, say, the rhetorical position of, if we're talking about Capitalist Realism, they're New Labour in the United Kingdom. So their stated position of wanting really small governments, wanting things run like businesses, quote unquote, a practice that Fisher describes as market ontology.
Business ontology.
Yeah, business ontology.
I really like that. That was one of my
ontology.
favorite concepts, actually.
Yeah. And then there's the practice of actually just expanding government, making it more invasive, deepening surveillance, making subjects internalize surveillance through the use of external auditing and internal auditing and then self-auditing to create this bizarre, at the same time, minimally invasive totalitarianism and internalized totalizing state. How do you view neoliberalism? Because it's such a slippery term.
Yeah, it is a slippery term. I don't know.
It blurs into a feeling quite often.
Yeah. Okay. I'll try my best. So, okay. Caveat, probably going to be wrong about this. So I just took like some quotes off the internet. So the first one is from the opening paragraph to Stanford Plato's like article on neoliberalism. It says that neoliberalism is generally thought to label the philosophical view that a society's political and economic institutions should be robustly liberal and capitalist, but supplemented by constitutionally limited democracy and a modest welfare state. I think it's very loaded. Like, there's a lot to unpack there, but yeah, sure.
Yeah, there's a lot. There's a lot there.
It's kind of understated. And then there's Naomi Klein, we should probably read one of her books. Like,
we should probably read something.
I read one of her books a while ago. I think. Did she write "This Is Not"? No, that was XR. I know she wrote something on like environmentalism or something, if I can remember correctly, but I might be misremembering. So this is pulled from Wikipedia, so whatever. Naomi Klein states that the three policy pillars of neoliberalism are: 1, privatization of the public sphere; 2, deregulation of the corporate sector; and 3, the lowering of income and corporate taxes paid for with cuts to public spending. Then when I speak to my friends who tend to be from Melbourne, or if not Melbourne or Sydney, like the sort of educated,
the north,
like North Melbourne, like north of the river, like educated professional class that Jack and I have spoken so fondly of before. It just seems to be used as just this like catch-all term for just like things that the person doesn't like, in much the same way that they use capitalism. So to me, it seems very vague. I actually asked one of my friends who like did his master's in like structuralist theory or whatever, like, what does neoliberalism mean? Because I was like, I'm confused. What are you talking about? And he's like, it's just like everything, man. It's like the culture. It's like, what, like fish don't realize that they're breathing water. It's like, you don't realize that you're breathing this culture. It's like everything around us. I was like, that's not really helpful.
Which begs the question, how do you know what neoliberalism
it's not helpful at all. So like, I've noticed that there's a few words that get used like this. Colonization gets used like this. Capitalism gets used like this, and neoliberalism gets used like this. So my at least working definition as a basic start is that even though it has this like ostensibly things like values of individual rights, equality before the law, like classical liberalism, individual sovereignty, government and governance based on consent and democracy, laissez-faire capitalism and free trade and commerce. But to my mind, it also pulls in like a lot of this stuff around like actually the state is a lot bigger and like so there's like this element of like surveillance and in particular, I think one of the key characteristics that seems to stand out for me is like this like corporatism, like these large scale corporates, often multinationals that are either in bed with governments or like lobbying governments and that sort of stuff. And so, like free trade for small businesses or like, solo entrepreneurs or whatever, or like, employees in small businesses looks a lot different qualitatively to like an enormous multinational corporation. And so I think like to me, corporatism and cronyism seems to be like a key.
That's a really good point because this also ties to something in capitalist realism that I think is describing something very real, how you have certain organizations that are notionally private but have effectively become quasi-government organizations,
Yeah.
such as big auditing firms.
So one of my friends, the same friend I was talking about, like he mentioned, I was like, like this company, big company, is not a part of the state. Like they're getting, and he's like, well, it depends what your definition of the state is, doesn't it? Like because if they're so intertwined with the government, like just because they're not a part of the same institution, like legally, like when they're so intertwined, doesn't that organization effectively become like state or like parastate or something? Good point. That's interesting.
Which is not
It's an
unreasonable.
interesting point. So, and the only other thing to say about it is like, yeah, the state can be like weirdly interventionist, and in particular around like the free trade stuff, like free trade agreements between countries are like anything but free trade. That's like the most, it's like one of those very Orwellian uses of language. And
it's a regulated free trade.
And the classic, and the classic like examples of neoliberal people like Reagan, Thatcher, probably like John Howard in Australia. And it seems as though the people that I talk to don't like these things that they do. Is like anytime they privatize like a public asset. So like, like if Australia were to like sell off Ozpost, turn it into a private company, or like what we did with, I think we did that.
John Howard.
I think we did that with Telstra, didn't we? Like Telstra.
Yeah.
Like that was a neoliberal thing to do rather than keep that as a public asset on the government's like books. Yeah. So I think that's enough. Do you think that's enough definitions and discussion preamble?
I guess enough. A while. I think it's good that we even got to neoliberalism.
Yeah.
I suppose in both of our very, very discursive answers to the question, what is neoliberalism, it demonstrates that it is such a slippery term that it's more often describing a feeling rather than a defined philosophical stance.
Yeah. So with that being said, I would like to ask you. So let's move.
How about we talk
we've got this key question.
An hour in.
What is? Yeah, sorry. Well, maybe it was.
No, not sorry. Like we
maybe
need
it was
to
worth it. Like hopefully it was worth it.
Hopefully people are still
maybe we
listening.
need to put chapters in so people can skip if they need to.
Shout out to you listener, if you're still listening. Big shout out.
What is? So I'm going to go and have a 30-second break, but I'm going to ask you a question so we can keep on talking. What problem is Mark Fisher trying to solve? Like, what's his problem situation? What is capitalist realism?
First of all, shout out to Isaac Bell Holmstrom. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Wrote me a very, very nice message about how he liked reading Tower. Shout out. So what is capitalist realism? What's Fisher trying to solve? So I'll probably answer what capitalist realism is first, because Fisher is ultimately trying to work out how to exit from this state. So in Fisher's telling, what capitalist realism is, it's fundamentally the sense that there is no alternative to capitalism, and particularly no alternative to the capitalism of when he wrote 2009. But I think many of the tendencies of the liberal democratic capitalist world in 2009 have only deepened. So I think it's still relevant in 2024. So he says the only way to exit from capitalism is by demonstrating the unreality of capitalist realisms. Capitalist realism is this sense of no exit that surrounds and protects capitalism and prevents it from being replaced by anything, because if you are within capitalist realism, anything outside of capitalism seems unrealistic. It can't possibly work. It's simply against the order of things. You're working against nature. So Fisher's project with this book, and outside of this book as well more broadly, was working out ways to break that illusion of capitalist realism. Because once, in his view, you can even crack that veneer of capitalist realism even slightly, then capitalist realism loses its power. Once it has been demonstrated that it's not totalizing, it's not in some way the will of the universe, that capitalism exists in the way that it does, that is when an exit from capitalism can be found. The difficulty is, as we'll get into, under capitalist realism, and it is really fun seeing how he does share some ideas with Nick Land, although he does diverge from Nick Land, and he addresses Nick Land actually in this, which is really interesting. A significant feature of capitalism and of capitalist realism is that they commodify almost anything, or at least so far, any attempt to exit, any attempt at rebellion is immediately commodified and turned into a, an aesthetic that can be bought and sold and marketed. And so even ostensibly anti-capitalist projects, so anti-capitalist films, books, music, public statements, are immediately folded back into commodities to be sold in a capitalist system. So he was searching for an exit from this. And he doesn't offer concrete ways to exit, but he does. There are particularly three areas that he says could be fruitful for working out exit from capitalism that were ecological catastrophe, mental illness, and the excessive and deepening bureaucracy of neoliberal, or he calls it late capitalist society. I don't really like the term late capitalist because it assumes that we know where we are within the capitalist lifespan, which I think is highly presumptuous. It's also, we seem to have been in late capitalism for a long time, and if there is a phase of capitalism after this one, it becomes linguistically difficult. You have late capitalism, later capitalism,
Post-late capitalism,
perhaps latest capitalism, right before
late
the fall.
night capitalism,
I'm not sure.
early morning capitalism. Yeah, sure. Yeah. So, like at a high level, did you find this concept, because he gets, I think he like explains it like up front, like pretty early on, right? So did you find it
Yeah,
did you find it an interesting, like what were your thoughts at a high level about this idea of capitalist realism?
really interesting, and I'm still thinking about it quite a lot now, and I will continue to do so because it's such a challenging idea. Because I definitely have the sense of there are alternatives to how capitalism is currently instantiated. Do I think that Australia on Sunday, the 11th of February, 2024, is the ideal political, economic, and social system that cannot possibly be improved and is
Yes.
such a
Yes, it
stable
is.
phenomenon that it can't be dislodged? Absolutely, I do. End of episode. See you next week. So, so while I think that, of course, individual or particular instantiations of capitalism, if you take it as I'll use capitalism in more of Fisher's sense as not just being an economic system, but also defining the political system, it's influencing the culture, which, even if it's, I think is actually quite reasonable because I do think how you interact with people economically is going to really deeply affect the culture. So I'll just state that. I mean it in that very expansive sense. Individual instantiations will come and go. And if, like, we've seen it in our, if not in our lifetimes, then in our parents' lifetimes at least. Like, the capitalism of 1950 is very different from that of 2024. And the capitalisms, say, that Adam Smith was writing about is so different from how it's currently carried out. So that we are aware of evolutions within that sphere, and I'm sure there will be more of them. But what Fisher's talking about, and what I find more interesting, is this idea of a sense of no alternative to a capitalism of private property and being able to exchange commodities and an accumulation of capital.
Yeah, and the profit motive. Yeah.
And this comes back to my ongoing interest in the idea of technique and interest in Nick Land. So my knowledge of Nick Land is still poor, but I'm working through Thirster Annihilation, which is fascinating and difficult. But this sense that you have a system that, whenever it is opposed, just commodifies that opposition and sells it back into the system. This idea that capitalism it's a system that I guess, takes into account energy in the sense of there are certain things that are highly inefficient, certain things that are more efficient, and over time, the things that are more efficient will outcompete those that are less efficient energetically. There is a real sense that, at least to my mind, that's very hard to compete with using systems that are more, I guess, command systems. So people working out what an economy should produce and then trying to make that happen, given that an individual has such, or a group of 10 people or 100 people has such a limited amount of information with which to make decisions about for a system that it feels like that can't possibly outcompete a a free market capitalist system. So this idea of there not being an alternative or it being so hard to think of alternatives is definitely something that resonated with me when Mark Fisher brought it up. Now, I'll add this. I'll preface everything I will say with this now, so I don't have to keep saying it. This could well be because I grew up under capitalist realism. This process was in place when I was born. It has been in place through my entire life. I have not known anything but capitalist realism. So I suppose Fisher would say, well, you feel like there is no alternative because that is capitalist realism. That is what I'm describing. And so that's one of the things I find really fascinating about this book, that I read it and think, yeah, but there isn't an alternative, but that is the problem he is describing, which is really fascinating. How did you feel when this idea of capitalist realism was pointed out and then expanded upon during this book?
I thought it was like a very fascinating idea. Yeah, absolutely.
Because I just see it so much in myself.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's good that he pointed it out, and as somebody who's interested in technology and entrepreneurship and economics and that sort of stuff, I guess it's good for me to have that checked, I suppose. And now I've got a useful word that I can now use as a shorthand to think through that. Yeah, so I guess I'm thinking out loud a little bit here, but if I could sort of just
I never do that. I never do that on this.
I guess
podcast.
I would distinguish between, and I think probably Mark Fisher would disagree with what I'm about to say, but yeah, maybe we can talk a little bit.
But this isn't his podcast,
about it.
Is it?
But I think they're related. They influence one another, but there's two aspects to capitalism that I think are important to keep separate. That I will call, one, the ideological aspect, and two, the engineering aspect. And I think they're really important to like at least separate in your head. There are concrete problems. This is not just like purely ideological. This is like, there are concrete problems about how do we use scarce resources in a society. How do we allocate those resources? How do we allocate them in a way that is efficient? How do we allocate them in a way that communicates the relative scarcity of them to one another, given that the combinatorial space of millions of products and stuff is just so enormous that we couldn't possibly do it in like an actual like lookup table or whatever. And these are very concrete economic problems. They're not just ideology. It's not reducible to ideology.
And could I just jump in? So when you talk about millions of products too, I'm assuming you don't mean, we want millions of different brands of peanut butter, for example. No. Like that's not the millions of products necessarily, because you could say, oh, well, in a command economy, you would only have one type. It's more to make like one thing. There is so much above that in the production chain that requires coordination. Is that what you mean when you talk about?
Yeah, there's a really fascinating article or paper called iPencil, which talks about this. It's amazing. It's like the guy who wrote the paper actually just tried to explore how complex is the production process for producing something that we consider simple, something as simple as lead or a graphite pencil. And actually, when you look at it's what it's painted with, the wood, like how the graphite is made, how it gets across the world, all the management that's required, all the contracts and the suppliers and stuff. It's actually really complicated. And he made this interesting point that no one person actually knows how to make a pencil. And that's a very simple product. It's actually like to bring a Faber-Castell pencil to your like local post office or wherever you buy your stationery from, is an incredibly complex process, let alone something like an iPhone or a car. And yeah, so there's that key resource issue, which is a really important issue. And societies that got it wrong last century, like millions and millions and millions of people died from starvation because they didn't get that. They got it wrong, and not millions, but like tens of millions of people died, and that's a really important. That's not ideological, and anybody who wants to say that's an ideological problem, like I think they're being reductive. And this is actually an issue of like, how do we get scarce resources used properly and minimize the amount of waste? And then the other part of the engineering problem, or maybe actually there's three parts to it. There's the engineering problem, there's the epistemic problem, and there's the ideological problem. And the epistemic problem is, as Hayek wrote, who like these people hate Hayek, he's a neoliberal philosopher, but he made this like point about like one of the key issues in economics is, he wrote this essay called Knowledge and Society or something like that. And he conceived of the core economic problem is, how do we best make use of diffuse knowledge that is spread out over millions of people? And like when you try to do a command central economy thing, you're trying to make all these decisions with essentially no knowledge, like proportionally, like vanishingly small proportion of the knowledge in the society. Whereas like in a market economy, you've got people from carpenters and mechanics to software engineers and doctors, like with their local specific knowledge that they're making use of. And so that's the epistemic aspect to it. And then there's the ideological aspect to it, which is like all the stuff around, well, the atomization of the individual and healthcare and these sorts of things that are important issues to talk about. And like corporatism and lobbying, and should we have this business ontology where we treat everything in society like a business? Those are all really important questions, except to me, reading this book and reading about capitalist realism, it's good to like have that counterpoint idea to make me distinguish between, okay, when am I thinking through like the engineering parts of it or the epistemic parts of it versus like, is this more of an ideological thing? And to what degree does ideological shape the other two, or do the other two constrain and shape the ideology?
Yeah, and none of these things exist in a vacuum. They're all influencing each other continuously.
And so, yeah, useful concept, interesting, thought-provoking. I don't think that, and I think that's basically because he's surrounded by other academics and hasn't really engaged with much economics in the book. He only references two economists in a book about capitalism. It's like these are actually like really pretty substantive issues. They're not peripheral. Yeah.
And I guess that's, so if I'm being Fisherbot, maybe you could say it's the very idea that the realistic or the necessary thing to do to engineer society, or to have the engineering solution to coordinate diffuse knowledge, to use finite resources which have multiple uses effectively. The idea that has to be, or is best coordinated with a free market, is itself a component of capitalist realism, and there are other solutions. I wonder if, so he didn't go into command economies and things like that. He did talk about the need to rediscover the general will, for example, which I find very threatening.
Of course, because you need somebody to interpret the general will, and it's almost inevitably academics. So
yeah, he didn't explicitly say that he wants
implied. No, it's not
economy.
It's not implied.
I guess so. Part of the value of the concept of capitalist realism is it even makes you think, okay, well, is there something else other than market and command economies? Is there a way that we're not seeing yet that might be able to coordinate better than a command economy, and might have less of what he would see as the waste of a market economy.
Yeah, and so I guess if I was to break down into my triad, like, is there an alternative to the engineering, or the maybe engineering is not a good word, but the resource allocation problem? Is there a concrete alternative to the epistemic or knowledge utilization problem? Like, those are, as I said, substantive problems, and like, it's not like there hasn't been an alternative that's been put forth and that makes any sense and that works. And uh and it's a good question, are there alternatives? But like, if you are going to suggest that we should look for something different, like, whatever the thing that you suggest is also has to address, though it can't just address the ideological stuff. It's got to address the resource allocation problem and the epistemic or the knowledge utilization problem. Those, like, that's just, anyways, with that being said, the ideological stuff that Fisher talks about is super interesting, because then you can always say, like, well, Levi, even given that stuff, how does that influence, like, the way people relate to each other, the way we, like, think about being in a society, the way that it informs our politics? Should it just be this kind of, as you said before, like, totalizing, hegemonic, like, overriding ideological thing that just infiltrates all of our social relations and so forth? Good questions, all good questions. That Fisher's has a lot of interesting ideas
that we are going to be talking about. So what's the first thing we'll talk about? So now we're going to go through the aspects and the key ideas of capitalist realism, of this thing that Fisher's describing, this sense that there is no alternative to capitalism, and meaning capitalism as a resource allocation system, as an ideology, as a method of relating to one another, things like that. One of the first things he talks about is the impulse of capitalism to make things fungible, to commodify things. And I can definitely see a lot of elements of this. I don't think this is frivolous. So he says that, what does capitalism, quote unquote, want? What does this system of social relations optimize for within the, I guess, almost the system of constraints? Which things within capitalism outperform other things? So he says things that get bought and sold more easily outcompete things in capitalism that don't. As such, things tend to get commodified, so made into things that can be exchanged for other things rather than necessarily consumed in themselves. And Fisher says that this leads to a flattening of things being made more and more fungible and easily exchanged, more standardized, because that makes them easier to buy and sell. He brings this up with respect to cultural artifacts, for example, and the increasing desacralization of things. So, for example, if something is sacred or religious or considered unique, that's something that's bought and sold with much more difficulty, because you're bringing in these non-capitalist dimensions to it. You're bringing in, say, spiritual dimensions that impede the free exchange of goods, which he doesn't say this explicitly, but I think it follows fairly naturally that could explain a large part of the loss of religiosity in the West, and increasingly in many non-Western countries as well, that religion resists things being made fungible and being made into commodities. Additionally, he talks about how deeply standardized actually a lot of our culture is, how it's a very, very dominant marketable thing or marketing tactic to talk about the use of, or the attractiveness of, individuality and personal expression. And then he looks into, okay, how do people express themselves? How do they express this individuality? Well, it's actually by consuming or buying and then advertising the consumption of a number of mass-produced products. So our individuality is actually itself just a collection of fungible goods to be consumed in a public way, in an outward-facing way. And I thought this discussion was really, really interesting because I think there are many aspects of our culture at the moment which are far more standardized than any other time in history I can think of, and far more resistant to being qualitatively unique and hard to sell in some way and increasingly fungible. Is this so? Referring back to your triad of the aspects of capitalism, I think you probably can draw a line actually from the engineering aspect of it to these cultural effects. I think a lot of these cultural effects could well be downstream of that engineering aspect of, okay, how do you coordinate a lot of people basically and their use of resources? What did you think of the fungibility, the unleashing of what Deleuze and Guattari called I think it's the unnameable thing of capitalism, latent in societies and constantly constrained by things like religion or familial loyalties, which has been, I mean, I'm taking this from Nick Land. Nick Land said that it was something to do with the introduction of the concept of zero into medieval and Renaissance Europe that ripped off these safeguards and set in motion the cybernetic deterritorialization of the world.
Nick Land. All right, I'm looking forward to the next book of his that we read. Yeah.
Yeah, it really is. It's obligatory that we're going to have to cover more of this stuff because our listeners really seem to love Nick Land.
He's so cooked.
He's such a fucking maniac.
I love it. It's funny.
The brilliant combination of being, I think, a truly profound thinker and completely unhinged.
Yeah, so, well, I don't know what this unnameable thing is. Maybe I missed that part and I don't understand it. But with regards, yeah. Okay.
Oh, I can go over that. Do you want me to go over
re-ask the question?
I think it is first. My knowledge of Deleuze and Guattari's, I think they called it the unnameable thing. Let me just double check to make sure I am using the correct terminology.
Yeah, you wouldn't want to be inaccurate on this podcast, Jack.
Unnameable thing, yeah. I wouldn't want to be inaccurate on this podcast. So I've read very little of these thinkers. My knowledge of this more comes from Nick Land. So
this is Deleuze passed through Nick Land, passed through Jack.
So they posited that capitalism, it's this latent potential that's present in all cultures, and a latent potential, I think of it through the lens of technique. So this drive, the drive for efficiency and standardization through standardized behaviors. They say that it's this latent potential in all cultures that's restrained by cultural forms to prevent its corrosive desacralization. So if you unleash this unnameable thing within a culture, it's going to start digesting everything around it, making everything around it into a form which only promotes the further advancement of I guess efficiency, in the sense of being able to pursue outputs more efficiently. It makes outputs into processes and processes into outputs. It eliminates almost that distinction between the two things. And they say that when finally those safety rails are ripped off, you get capitalism spreading out through a culture, dissolving everything, desacralizing everything, and making a system no longer governed by any sort of transcendent law. Everything's governed according to a law of what is more efficiently going to produce more processes which themselves can be made more efficient. Fisher actually says that these deterritorializing impulses of capitalism have been largely confined to finance, and the reterritorializing forces have presided over culture, which is interesting. And that's why he says that finance has been driven more and more towards efficiency, whereas culture under what he calls late capitalism has stagnated. It's become extremely backwards looking. Interestingly, this is kind of more applicable today than it might have been in 2009. Anyone who's lost interest in films like me, or at least in popular films, because they just all seem to be rehashes of Star Wars or Marvel movies, or re-release or remakes of Disney movies that were popular 30 years ago, might feel similar. The cultural stagnation of re-territorialization in the cultural field. But
so
we can talk about that later.
Given that you've just explained
that's my understanding of
could you re-ask the
thing.
question of me so I can try and give you a reasonable response?
Yeah, so you asked me what was the unnameable thing. Wait,
you asked me what do I think
question?
of that idea about the fungibility of everything, and I was like, yeah, but what is the unnameable thing?
Yeah, I guess it is a restrained drive to optimizing processes in society for the sake of optimizing processes in society, which is restrained by cultural forms like familial obligations to a particular deity, and certain restrictions on things like usury or finance.
Yeah, it's interesting, I guess. Like so I kind of see what they're talking about. This at least certain aspects of capitalism, obviously efficiency can be very important in production processes of machines like cars or whatever. There's this whole Lean Six Sigma thing that came out of Toyota about like reducing the error rate of things to 1 part in a million or whatever it was, the error rate that they were trying to get to. Six Sigma, I think that's 1 in a million. And there is that, and that does lead to things that are fungible. And what's driving that is partially the economies of scale, where like as you produce more of something, the marginal cost of producing the next unit of that thing drops, and you can like amortize capital expenses over like the entire like productive output and that sort of stuff. So that's definitely something in the world for sure. I guess to me, at least, there's not only that. That's not the only thing that's going on, and that doesn't ever exist in a cultural vacuum, and it always exists in like a culture, a political context, and those things do put constraints on that. And people, like a good example is like in places like Australia, we've had the labor movement throughout the 20th century, where now we've got you can like whatever, maybe libertarians or something would have like some issues with some of the constraints, whatever. Putting that sort of thinking aside, not that it's completely irrelevant, but it's much better to be a worker now than it was 100 years ago in terms of like your rights, your ability to like take action against your employer, your ability to form associations depending on your industry, like in unions and that sort of thing. And yes, there's always issues, but to me, like just these people like Fisher and Deleuze and stuff, it seems as though like they think this efficiency drive is totalizing, and it's just like destroying it's like acid through the society. And I just don't see it that way. Like I see plenty of like counterbalances and like and also ways in which like entrepreneurial capitalism doesn't necessarily only optimize for efficiency. It can be good, but there's things like, and he wasn't, he wrote this book before the modern movement of like influencers and stuff online, but the idea that you can go and do something like create a YouTube channel about a very niche, weird thing, like Hermetics, the YouTuber who does the stuff about Gnosticism. What is that his name? Hermetics.
Hermetics, like he interviews people who are writing books about weird stuff. Yeah. He's interviewed Gnostics, I'm pretty sure.
He's able
he does a lot of weird stuff
and do what he really enjoys. And it's an extremely obscure thing to do, and that's enabled. It's not necessarily efficient. in the sense of like these production lines and stuff, because it's the capital like machine is not just about efficiency, although that can be important. It's actually about satisfying the wants and needs and preferences of consumers. And sometimes what consumers want is something that isn't necessarily efficient, such as like
I think when you talk about efficiency, it might be slightly differently
Okay.
to how these people are
Yeah.
meaning it. And also when you talk about, it's important to separate out Deleuze and Fisher on one hand and Land on the other, because Deleuze and Fisher both think that you can't have absolute totalizing capitalism. So you need some sort of
Yeah.
reterritorializing impulse. You need some
Yeah.
sort of some sort of waste for capitalism to live. Whereas Nick Land seems to think that
Yeah. It just
capitalism
drive.
will just, like, it spits out those things. It's just going to integrate
Yeah.
everything.
Yeah.
So in terms of the efficiency, so it's efficiency towards what? So talking about, say, the labor movement is interesting in the context of
Yeah. And Fisher's got some
efficiency,
opinions on
because
that, which is good.
many things have just been offshored. So it's like there is a labor movement in Australia, and because of that, a lot of companies have just moved operations to places where
Yep.
there isn't a labor movement,
Yeah.
which I suppose would be Fisher's response to that. That yes, there are impulses to constrain capitalism, or this capitalist drive for basically outputting things that consumers demand at a lower cost. There are things impeding that in Australia, but then producers just go
Yeah,
elsewhere.
sure. And he's got some really interesting thoughts on labor and stuff, which we can get into. And I don't want to spend all my time just like criticizing, like trying to explain and that sort of stuff. But one of the interesting things that he did point out that you mentioned, sort of like in this sort of section, is the desacralization or
Mm.
sacralization. Can I just clarify that that's referring to like commodifying the transcendent,
It's like the removal of the
sacred.
sacred.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. I don't. Uh, so perhaps that is something that's happening. I don't know how related that is to capitalism and technology. It seems like they're probably related.
I think
Yeah,
the two are
and
highly related.
uh, I guess to me, there's it's also important to remember that there's things outside the market. Uh, so like the exchange market, and those things matter as well. And if one of those things is like your religion, maybe you don't engage in like anything to do with market transactions with regards to your religion. And yeah, I don't necessarily see that as like in conflict. Yeah, but is the ascent of capital and the deepening of technological production processes and stuff, is that driving or like contributing to the desacralization of the world? Interesting question. I'm not sure. How much are they related?
I'd say the two definitely coincide quite strongly. And I think oftentimes they are working at odds to each other, because there are a lot of, say, religious movements do promote things that slow down
Mm,
capitalism.
mm, mm.
Say the bans on usury is one of the most obvious ones, but then things like don't work on
Yeah,
Sunday,
yeah. In fact, yeah. I guess the sovereign individual
like that,
made this point.
in a society that's driving where like religious worship doesn't happen in a
Yeah,
vacuum, and say in Australia, it happens within the context of almost every decision you're making. On some level, it is touched by, well, I need money, I need to spend money on things. Like how is this working? It's that is the background to a lot of what we do, and certain things that work against that or impair that are just a disadvantage. And if someone believes in it strongly enough, like they're going to continue to believe in it. But over time, I think it does corrode the sacred.
yeah. Interesting. Yeah, I guess to me, partially what it's doing is like maybe they would say this is part of like the neoliberalism stuff, is like a lot of this pattern in society that you're pointing at, that we're pointing out, like the desacralization and that sort of thing. Uh, seems to be also coming from like putting a lot of responsibility for all these different things on the individual. And I don't know, like who's putting the responsibility on? It's just like this kind of, I don't know, like the cultural milieu of individualism. And, like Fish talks about this later in the book, which we might touch on, is like mental health individual thing. It's not considered in like a community context or anything like that. So like it's just like the individual versus the world, or the individual versus the market. And it's on you to figure out how to do these things. So yeah, I think it's super interesting. Like, it's something to definitely ponder on. I think for me, at least.
Yeah, there's so much in this book that's really, really interesting to think about, and it provides a nice frame to consider the world through, which might be the most valuable part of this book.
Should we move on to market ontology or business ontology?
Yeah.
Yeah,
business ontology. Yeah,
I really loved it. I like this. Do you want to explain what business ontology is?
Yeah, it's really straightforward, and it's something you do see a lot. So it's effectively when people talk about how everything should be run as a business, as a good thing, is basically what Fisher calls business ontology. And so Fisher says certain things like education or healthcare shouldn't be viewed through the lens of business ontology because, say, in the case of education, so he uses education as an example through much of this book because he worked in the British further education system for a number of years as a lecturer. He says, for students, for example, are students the consumers of the product of education if it is run as a business, or are they the output? And he uses that as a way of saying, just saying a school or a higher education institution or a university should be run as a business is not as obvious as certain people make it out to be. That, well, running it as a business is by nature good. And he identifies a number of the problems with education in the United Kingdom as stemming from this business ontology, as stemming from a confusion as to what education should be, because it hasn't been examined. It's just been stuffed into this, I guess, quasi business like arrangement. Is there any aspect of the concept of business ontology that I missed?
No, I think that's good. You can see it being applied to everything from like churches to like higher education, that sort of thing. Yeah, it is interesting. I guess it is to their point, this like totalizing effect of the ideology. It's like, okay, but should we really be treating education as business? And I guess if I could distinguish, maybe I'm not, maybe I'm going too far out on a limb here, but like distinguishing between, like, as I said before, the resource allocation problem of like running an educational institution where you do have a certain amount of money and you've got to do stuff with that money and you try to use that money to the best that you can, versus like, I guess what he'd mean by like business ontology is not just like the accounting of stuff, but actually like kind of the ideological approach that you're taking to the way that you operate and the culture of like the employment and the way that you treat the students and so forth. And yeah, implicitly, like we saw that in at our university. I think that's how it felt. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's kind of like this weird contradiction between like the university has these lofty ethical goals around like what do we stand for and all this sort of stuff, and it's like, yeah, but you're also just like milking international students for all they're worth, and like
yeah. And even as a domestic student, quite often I felt like I was viewed as just this bag of possible Commonwealth funding.
So yeah, I don't really have I don't really necessarily even disagree with him. I think it's just a really useful concept to me.
It's a really useful concept, and it does sound very obvious when you phrase it like that. It's, yeah, maybe not everything should be run as a business because not everything is necessarily a business. Because you could just frame education as a public good. It's okay. We just need to educate children.
And yeah, I would say that this book is,
and yeah, I guess you can decompose that into okay, well, you need this thing to be a stable phenomenon through time. So it can't just be bleeding off energy, whether that's measured as money, for example. It can't be too too costly to run, otherwise it's not going to function through time. I suppose it'd be interesting to know whether, I assume he probably would view it this way. Again, that resource allocation problem, I imagine he would actually also say is an aspect of capitalist realism, that even thinking in terms of how much money does this thing cost to run is itself within the framework of there not being an exit, or you not believing that there's an exit to
I
capitalism.
suppose so. I mean, yeah, not gonna like criticize too much. The small thing is just like,
I have a
yeah, but you do have to consider how much resources your thing is going to. Like, we could just spend all of society's resources on educating people, and we'd get nothing else done. Like,
to educate one person.
That is just maybe it's capitalist realism, or maybe it's just actually the case that you have to think about resource trade offs, whether you want to use a monetary unit of account or whatever. Like, it is something that you have to do, even if you want to try to like approach education without the profit motive and so forth.
And this is why the idea of considering the concept of capitalist realism is really interesting for me, because when I think of that brute resource allocation problem, that's where I really hit that, well, there's no alternative idea of, well, you have to take this into account. Of course you do. And so it's interesting trying to see how much of that is because I've been raised in a capitalist realist environment, and how much of it is because, no, there actually just are resource constraints that you need to deal with, because that's what I
guess if we
to.
could distinguish between like admitting or like accepting constraints of resource allocation and so forth, versus like centering like a business mindset, like making that like a central part of the way that you think about the institution and the way that you want to run it, and so forth, like which I think I think presumably if he was still alive, he might agree with us. Like, I think
we'd have him on the show and we'd be grilling him right now.
Yeah. Anyways, cool, interesting. I found this book basically full of like interesting, now I suppose words that I can use to point to certain things, even if like the overall narrative I disagree with. I think he's like picked up on some really interesting things like business ontology. Do you want to pick the next thing, the next major thing that he talks about?
Yeah. So there's the belief that we are past believing in meta narratives. He talks about a lot. So Mark Fisher had a lot of problems with postmodernism. I guess this is again a term that we might need to.
Oh yeah, we missed that one.
Define, even if the definition is not something that everyone agrees with, and it won't be, because this is just there's a term that's thrown around so much to the point where it's almost meaningless. But I will say what I mean when I talk about postmodernism, just so we have a bit of clarity. And so postmodernism, to my mind, is a reaction against modernism. So modernism, the late 19th, early 20th century idea of, there are a few aspects to modernism. So it was this belief in human progress, that human progress is directed towards something, whether it is, I guess in the modernist context, it often related to technology, improving mastery over the world. There was also this belief that there was some sort of external world that you could be measured against. And a lot of the project was finding ways to measure oneself against this external world and this shared experience. Postmodernism, on the other hand, as a reaction to that, loses trust in what postmodernists, or some of them, would call meta-narratives, these overarching narratives of things like human progress or technological advancement, and the belief that there is any sort of objective neutral ground from which to view these things. They regard human experience as fragmented, not only fragmented interpersonally, so say my experience of the world is fundamentally different from yours, and to a large extent we can't actually communicate over that gap. There's not a neutral position from which we can mediate our two experiences, but also within a person's experience. So through time, a person's experience might actually not be, you can't intermediate between someone's experience at two different points. So that's very roughly what I think of when I think of postmodernism. And I think it's largely concordant with what Fisher means, and particularly what Jameson means, because Fisher will quote Jameson at length in this book when discussing postmodernism, and how, to Fisher's mind and to Jameson's mind, postmodernism marches in lockstep with capitalism, which I don't disagree with. I think for its, I guess, aesthetic disavowals of capitalism, it's such a deeply subjectivist movement that it lends itself very, very nicely to the exchange theory of value, like remarkably well to the exchange theory of value. And it also promotes this naivety that Jameson talked about, which we can talk about. So this is a lengthy prelude to this aspect of capitalist realism that keeps us firmly ensconced within capitalist realism. The postmodernist belief that we are past meta-narratives, that we now are able to cease to believe in meta-narratives.
So I'm just going to go with what you described as postmodernism, because again, it's such a slippery term that,
it's such a slippery term. Most of the time you hear it now, it will be, I don't know, like Ben Shapiro or someone like that describing just anything to the left of
it. So if neoliberal is the boogeyman of the left, then postmodern is the boogeyman of the right. Postmodern neo-Marxists. Woke critical theorists. Gender ideology. Oh man, like there's people like fighting over these things. It's weird, isn't it? We live in a strange time. Anyways, so what does he mean by meta narratives? Maybe Levi's being a dum here, but
so a meta narrative,
could elucidate.
Meta narrative could be something like history has a direction and it bends towards human progress. So that could be a meta narrative. It's something that you view, you can use to view everything through. It's something that can contain a worldview. So you would view all current events as tending towards increasing human progress. Human progress being effectively people becoming more like liberal democratic Westerners.
Yeah, so that would be like what's his name, Francis Fukuyama or whatever, about like the end of history sort of vibe. Liberal or neoliberal, like.
Or during the Cold War, I suppose you could say there were these meta narratives of, on one hand, in capitalist countries, of capitalism overcoming communism, of human freedom and free exchange overcoming communism. In communist countries, there is definitely the Marxist meta-narrative of, you have these particular discrete stages of history which lead to one another, although that has become more subtle in the days since Marx's fairly crude formulation of.
Yeah, I guess for me,
But there still is a meta-narrative within Marxism of the proletariat eventually overthrowing the bourgeoisie, of the contradictions within capitalism eventually becoming untenable, leading to the collapse of capitalism, eventually leading to, through several stages of history, communism. That itself is a meta-narrative.
So it's a high-level narrative that's supposed to contain more, or be a framework.
Yeah, that contextualizes narratives like within it. It's almost like a system of coordinates or of reference points.
And so like a particular narratives, say, communist country is telling their like more local idiosyncratic national narrative in the framework of the larger communist or larger Marxist meta-narrative. Okay.
Meta-narrative. Okay. Yeah.
And so, on that note, I think that clarifies a little bit of what Fisher was talking about for me. Yeah. So he's saying that under this quote unquote late stage capitalism and postmodern culture, we believe that we are past believing in meta narratives. Wouldn't that itself be a meta narrative? Yeah.
That is exactly what he says. And I think
Yeah.
that is completely true, because we like it's not that we've in some Nietzschean way just reevaluated values. Like we still definitely have social mores and social morality. And like you said, the belief that we no longer have meta narratives is itself a meta narrative. It is a narrative structure used to contextualize other
Yeah.
narratives that we
Yeah.
tell.
Yeah.
And Fisher says that it reinforces capitalist realism by reinforcing this idea of something being real or something being realistic.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
he says people will look at meta narratives of the past and say, "Oh, it is completely unrealistic," because we now that
Transcended
we've
meta narratives
the yeah, we've transcended meta narratives. We now see what's realistic, and what is realistic
is the
is
market.
the
Yeah.
market,
Okay. Yeah.
effectively. Yeah, it is
Yeah.
capitalism. And he says this identification of capitalism with something being real. He uses I think it's a Lacanian distinction between reality, which obscures the real, capital R real, which can never be seen face on, but you can see
Okay.
fragments of it.
So
Sorry, through the world. It might not. We might not need to really go into that Lacanian aspect of it here, because that's one of the less compelling parts of this book for me. But I think his idea of this postmodernist idea of transcending meta narratives in favor of us only seeing reality and reality happening to keep defaulting to basically capitalism is really interesting, and actually probably is a form of capitalism basically just taking in, I guess, a sensible opposition to it, digesting it and making it into a justification for itself.
yeah,
It's a way
like
that
what
you
you're
can
saying.
see it
Yeah.
happening, and I think there's a lot
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
truth to this
Well, I guess
this
we
claim.
don't. Yeah. So very interesting point. Again, like another useful thing to think about this like idea of meta narratives and the capitalist realist meta narrative that we're beyond meta narratives. But I guess like I know you don't want to like go into it too much because it's a whole thing like the Lacanian like real versus reality. But maybe we could just touch on it enough to
Yeah,
because it's in
sure.
the title of the book, right? So we probably need to talk about it a little bit. So why don't
Yeah.
I give it a crack, and you can correct me,
Mm-hmm.
and anybody in our audience who happens to know more about Jacques Lacan and his thinking, please correct our ignorance on this one. My ignorance, or don't,
Or don't. Just agree with us. Publicly agree with us.
He had this interesting idea of reality versus the real. And okay, so as far as I could understand, let's see if I get my notes down here, is that the real is more like an ideological framework. So it is I think Jack's going to correct me in a tick. Yeah, so
I think it's the other way around. Yeah.
he noted this author. I should have put the name down, but like a thinker that influenced him said the reality principle. The ideology presents itself as empirical fact, and the real is what any quote reality must suppress. What is what? Yes, and so you have this distinction between what is actually the case, and then I suppose what is the ideologically explained to be what is the case. So it's more like, I guess, like the like ontology ideology gap.
Because I think it's worth, within the context of Jacques Lacan, and again, I have not gone into Lacan much because I find him
Yeah.
a bit irritating. But the problem is me finding him irritating, and because of that, not looking into him very much means that when I have to explain Lacanian concepts, I can't do a very good job. But okay, this is at least like the distinction between reality and the real in my mind. So when we as human beings interact with the world, we're interacting with whatever nominally exists exterior to us. We're interacting with the phenomena that appear in our minds through interaction with something noumenal exterior to ourselves through senses, and those are run through mental models. So we've got a particular narrative apparatus in our minds that that situates these phenomena that we perceive. And so you've got the real, which is this thing that exists, this thing exterior to us, but we can't see it we can't see it dead on because we're always interpreting it through realities or lower, he spells reality with a lowercase r, real with an uppercase r. But so realities are these interpretations of the world run through our mental narrative models, run through our senses and rendered into our minds as phenomena that they'll never perfectly correspond to the real. We can sort of infer what the real might look like by looking at the discrepancies between these different realities that present themselves to us. And this distinction between realities and the real, and yeah, actually, it was the right thing of you to do to make us describe these things, because I guess in looking for an exit from capitalist realism, it does become important. He says the exit to capitalist realism is by collecting realities as presented to us by capitalism that are obviously discordant with other realities or other things that the real is throwing up. And by seeing this discordance with the real, we might be able to crack capitalist realism and find a way out of it. So at least for me, that's the real.
So when he says
reality.
realism, which of those two is he referring to? Reality. Okay.
Reality.
So let me double check just so I'm on the same page, so I'm not getting my wires crossed. So the real is the ideological part, and
reality is the ideological part, because the real is just this thing, this noumenal thing out there that you can't interact with directly. You're only ever interacting it with it like your sense experience run through your mental
real
models.
Capital R, the real is like the ontological, the numinous, and realities are ideological or phenomenological. Okay.
Yeah.
Try to keep
at least
that
I think so.
So,
and if there are any Lacan stands listening to us, and I just completely fucked that up,
let's use that going forward. And if we fuck that up, then so be it. We'll just carry error carried forward. Okay, we only lose marks once.
Yeah, and then someone should subscribe to our Patreon and let us know there.
Okay, so with all that being said, that's great. I think it was important to note that stuff.
Yeah, you're right.
It's in the title of the book. So capitalist realism then is really talking about these phenomenological, ideological stuff. We need it, and he's interestingly he points out a bunch of would you call them almost like symptoms, these cultural pathologies that maybe we can talk about some of them.
Yeah.
Actually, this might be the good way to frame sort of the conversation for a bit. There's cultural pathologies that are a consequence of this capitalist realism. And then he talks a bit about how his proposed approach of where to start to puncture through it. So do we want to talk a bit about some of the cultural pathologies? I think these were some of the interesting parts of the book as well.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, we can do that.
Did you have an
in terms of looking at through the exits?
Yeah.
We'll leave that for later. But
because I found I got a lot out of his discussions about here's a thing that's messed up, and it's an aspect of capitalist realism. So
I think that was when he's at his best, when he's diagnosing problems in our society that are real problems. I'm not going to deny the reality of a number of the things that he brings up. Reality in the non-Lacanian sense. The existence of a number of the problems that he brings up here.
I think that's a really good way to put it. It's he has when I found out that he committed suicide, when I read the introduction to the book or the foreword, I was like, oh man, that's a tragedy. Yeah, it's so young. He was only 40 something. I was like, damn, that's sad. All that. And then I read the first chapter of the book, and I'm like, oh well, that explains why he killed himself. He's just it's such an incredibly negatively valenced interpretation of the world around him. And I was like, oh, okay, I think this might be a situation where like somebody's psychology is also incredibly heavily influenced by their explanatory framework for the world. So we're going to go over some ways in which Mark Fisher, perhaps quite insightfully, like diagnosed some interesting cultural issues. Which one would you like to talk about first? We've got a few down there. Like,
yeah. How about cynicism and irony? Because that is that's something that is so pervasive.
You get started. I'm going to take.
And that also ties into what we were talking about before, how capitalism has arrogated to itself sort of the ground truth of reality under capitalist realism. The idea that there are no more meta narratives. There's nothing more that is arbitrary in this sense. Instead, now under capitalist realism, we view what is real, what is really there, and this leads to this deep sense of cynicism and irony, and they function in slightly different ways to reinforce capitalist realism, but both of them strongly reinforce capitalist realism. So in the sense of cynicism, for example, he at one stage compares the films Heat and The Godfather, and this can be used to look at one of the roles of cynicism in reinforcing capitalist realism. So The Godfather is the criminals in The Godfather are deeply ensconced within a framework that in many ways works against the advancement of technique or of capitalism, because they don't optimize for perfect efficiency. These familial obligations, these obligations to a culture from Italy that has been transplanted into the United States. He compares this to Heat, a film where the criminals in it are the ringleader is this guy who says, "Yeah, I don't get attached to anything. There's nothing in my life that I won't walk out on in 30 seconds flat." All of the people with whom he works are hired professionals who are not there for any sort of purpose beyond just making cash. They just want to get a job done. They just want to perform their technique well, efficiently, and leave. And the cynicism comes in reinforcing capitalist realism, where it views the criminals in Heat as being more realistic. So they understand how the world works better. They're more aware of they've lost this naive attachment to place or time or anything more abstract like that. They view reality. He talks about the cynicism also being present, for example, in rap. He says that part of the reason why rap's doing so well, and why, like, after 2009, rap's just gotten bigger, because in large part, rap really commodifies this cynicism, this belief that rappers see what the world truly is. They don't see it through a romantic lens of being attached to a time or a place. Instead, they see it as violence, acquisition of resources, and not much more. It is. He describes it as being real, and that happens to be highly commodifiable. And it's interesting in the context of Heat and rap. You can see how cynicism reinforces capitalist realism by dismissing the existence of anything above the supposed reality of capitalism, of this Darwinian struggle for resources which justifies capitalism. So that's the way in which cynicism is, at least in Mark Fisher's telling, used to reinforce capitalism. Irony functions slightly differently, but it also reinforces capitalism. He says that irony is this way basically for people to act in a way that just completely supports capitalism by being a management consultant, while interiorly being able to disavow capitalism. So not feel any sort of tension between their beliefs and actions. So, like, I have met people who work for McKinsey who will claim to be socialists, that will disavow capitalism and things like that. And I think, yeah, mate, you work for McKinsey. Like, it's completely incoherent that you hold these beliefs. Or people who work for international corporate law firms whose clients are Gazprom and things like that, who will also claim to have like some sort of Marxist beliefs. And Fisher says that irony allows this to to continue because these people interiorly feel a disconnect from what they're doing. They interiorly disavow it. And so exteriorly can basically fulfill functions that allow this to continue while ironically distancing themselves from their own behavior.
Man, I knew you would like this section. Of like that. There's this. Yeah, I knew you would like.
Yeah,
this
is a good section. I've met a lot of people like this, and they never fail to shit me up the wall.
Oh, that's so funny. Yeah, it's interesting. It's like you're working at BCG on like I don't know, what is it called, ESG, like environmental and social goods, or is that what it stands for? I don't know, environmental sustainability and governance or something. And it's like, but
something like that.
Like, what are you actually concretely doing? And then it's funny if you ask sometimes like these people, and I think there's a party I was at where you were quite pointed with one of your questions.
Yeah, so I met someone who worked at one of the big 4 banks in Australia on ESG, and I just said straight up, like, what do you think?
And didn't
actually
they just say like,
any
nah?
He was like, nah. We have to sell like 80% of our portfolio.
And it's really just, and actually, again, it's like, I think like Mark Fisher as a diagnostician, I would say what I'm about to say conforms to one of his diagnoses, which is like the obsession with representation instead of actually like doing something. So you're as a corporation.
Reading this made me think a lot of so The Society of the Spectacle by Guy Debord,
which is influential on Fisher as well.
I read probably 6 months ago, and I reckon will be actually quite good for this podcast. We would need to do some preparatory reading, particularly on commodity.
How long is it?
Fetishization.
Is it like a multi-episode one, or is it? Oh, that's fine.
160 pages or so. It's
quite
dense, but it's not very long.
Like an interest. I'd be interested in reading that.
Yeah.
Sure.
It's a good book. I really liked it.
Yeah. Really interesting, this idea of like interiority. It's almost like you need an internal sense of coherence versus like if you're in a bureaucracy in a university and you like the example that he gives is you interiorly have disdain for the bureaucracy and the processes and stuff, but then exteriorly like you actually have to do them. So you do it in this kind of like ironic, detached
way.
I guess it would be like deadening, wouldn't it, to do that sort of thing, like for you're like doing one thing with your body and then thinking another thing with your mind. Interesting.
Yeah, and I think he used the example, it was some administrative bureaucrat in British further education of whom Fisher said this person had this 1960s baby boomer hippie anti-authoritarian self-image, and while at the same time behaved as a highly controlling bureaucrat, while also maintaining this at least affective distance from it and ironic detachment from his work. The thing is too, it's like just because a number of my friends now work in these sorts of roles, you can also see the ironic detachment at work.
Yeah, that must be a huge
so Fisher is
issue.
Fisher as diagnostician, I think, that's when he's at his best.
I guess it's nice to talk about the ideas, but in like with this particular thing, I don't necessarily have like a criticism of it. It's interesting. I think to like, okay, try to come up with a criticism. Maybe if like maybe it's just because he's arguing it in the book, but I can see that thing happening. My reservation would be to what degree is it like as all pervasive as he claims it to be. This I was thinking about this in the shower thoughts before the episode, is like sometimes I think people make the mistake of what I call the monolith people conceive of, especially with regards to groups of people. So like if like somebody asked me a question about Indigenous Australians, and it's presupposing some sort of homogeneity or like monolithic sort of like culture or something, and I have to explain to them actually there's a lot of diversity like my experience of being Indigenous is extremely different to other people's, and all this like complexity and stuff. So like the sort of basis of your question is not like, we have to, put some caveats around it. But another type of mistake, which I think is slightly different but related to the monolithic mistake, is what I call, or the monolithic misconception is class of misconceptions, is what I think I'm going to call the miasma mistake, or the miasma misconception. So you just have like, you say this thing is just like all pervasive. It's like the air we breathe. It's like the cold, like you can't get out of this thing. It's this miasma that's just like you're breathing in. It's constant, and it's not monolithic. It's diffuse. It's systemic, and like when people are making those sorts of claims, like Mark Fisher, because the world's so big and complex and stuff, you can sit down and you could probably fill up 1,000 pages of examples of that sort of stuff happening. But filling up 1,000, like giving me 1,000 examples of something happening, does not mean that it's pervasive because of how big the world is and stuff. Like you have to go beyond just listing examples. And I don't necessarily find just like listing more and more examples any more compelling than like the first example that the person gives. Unless they're able to like go beyond an argument, like give an argument beyond just listing examples.
Yeah, I think I wouldn't even call it a criticism of it. I would call it sort of contextualizing this. I would say this is, at least in my experience, just because I know a lot of people in university educated white collar jobs, this is a very, very, like, this is highly descriptive of the, I guess, corporate world or white collar public sector university educated world, a highly bureaucratized environment. And it becomes more acute the more, so it's sort of, I almost regard it as bureaucratically rapacious the organization is. So, for example, with a large international London corporate law firm, which I won't name, but a lot of the people whom I know who work there have come through the university system. And as a result of going through like a number of years of higher education, many of them have, I guess, what Curtis Yarvin would call like a universalist philosophy. So they tend to be very, very socially liberal, very interested in social justice, things like that. And then because they also tend to be highly motivated by prestige within their social group of highly educated white collar workers, they go for organizations like city corporate law firms, which are highly rapacious organizations. Like they will be working for clients whose existence kind of goes against the stated beliefs of many of the workers there, to work on deals for those organizations, to do things like prevent them paying taxes or let them get around sanctions. They'll accept payment in diamonds and oil and cash and gold, all sorts of things that kind of you would expect your average member of socialist alternative on campus wouldn't like. But those people are now working for these organizations. And I think in that context particularly, Fisher's description of the use of cynicism and irony in allowing people to continue working in those organizations is very, very accurate. Does this apply to a plumber? No. No, it doesn't. Like, does it apply to an electrician? No.
Yeah.
So I think the more bureaucratic a job and the more a job has this kind of rapaciousness at a remove, where you are just a cog in a machine that is acting to do things that I think many of the individual people within that organization would not like, but feel that if I were to leave, I would just be replaced by someone else who'd do the same thing. So I may as well draw the paycheck for it. The more a job aligns with that, the more valid Fisher's diagnosis is.
For sure.
At least to my
like getting a knowledge work job and software engineering is still creative and it's interesting. I wouldn't say it has necessarily the same. I guess it depends what company you're working for. Sure, you could work for, I don't know, unnamed companies that just what you've just described, and you're a replaceable engineer who's just like trying to optimize like trading algorithms or something. Like, but that aside, like I find software engineering creative and interesting, and not necessarily like that. But I will say, despite that, getting a knowledge work job and like seeing white collar work and stuff has given me just like so much more respect for like the trades and cross based professions. As yeah, just I think they just have to deal with so much less of this crap that I kind of jealous at times. Just like imagine just being an electrician and just like being able to go, you just do a good job, fix the thing, the people pay you, and now you feel good because you've made their home safer or whatever, and you've gotten paid. Like, just yeah. Anyways, kind of jealous at times.
It doesn't even have to be something like that. It's just like there doesn't have to be this gulf between your stated beliefs or your ideals and then what you do for 14 hours a day. This
that must be
gap.
Terrible. So could we move on to another diagnosis that he gets right? I'm going to talk about, I really like this concept, into passivity. So
this is
let me scroll down to my notes so that I don't.
This is so interesting. This is such a good
term. Mess this up. So my understanding of interpassivity that I've written down for myself is the media, Hollywood and so forth, performs our anti-capitalism. So if you have an anti-capitalist sentiment, the media performs that on our behalf, allowing the person who ostensibly holds an anti-capitalist point of view to just, as Mark Fisher says, to consume with impunity. So you don't actually have to back up your anti-capitalist feelings or thoughts with some sort of meaningful action behind them. You know, you've essentially outsourced that to, well, you know, this Hollywood film. You know, there was actually, I hated this film, man. Did you see this film? It's this film about a boat, and there's these Instagram influencers. They win some. There's a couple who are Instagram influencers, and they win a ticket to go on this boat, and it's full of rich people, basically, like an arms dealer and like, I don't know, like some Russian entrepreneur who sells fertilizer or something, like, and they're all douchebags, basically. Everybody's a douchebag. And then the boat crashes and they end up on an island, and it turns into this kind of like Lord of the Flies sort of funny thing where the Filipino like chef or whatever becomes like, because she's the most useful person, becomes the head of the tribe on the island, and like where all the rich douchebags are like dependent on her and stuff. And it's like, it's a good premise for a film, but then the actual execution was lame. I really didn't like it. And it is one of these films that it is this. The person who directed it is a Marxist, maybe even French, if I remember correctly. And they have all these criticisms about capitalism. Like it's just so on the nose, just like, I'm criticizing capitalism and stuff. It's like, fine, whatever. But then it's like, at least according to Fisher, he'd be saying, well, yeah, but in making that film and just selling it like a commodity, like every other fucking film, and now it's on Netflix or whatever, your audience and what you're like participating in as the director and the film producers, you're participating in this like interpassivity. You're just allowing your audience to externalize or outsource their anti-capitalist sentiments to you, and now they can just go back to the next movie on Netflix, and I've got a good thing to talk about at the next party I go to or whatever.
Because it's interesting thinking of Fisher's problem situation, where he was trying to work out, why under capitalism are there so many anti-capitalist films or pieces of music or books, and why don't they seem to do anything? And one of the explanations he came across is this idea of interpassivity, as opposed to interactivity. So interactivity, you are taking some sort of action. Interpassivity, you're taking part in a passive consumption of anti-capitalism.
Did you have any thoughts about it? What do you reckon?
I guess also, so in addition to the function of allowing someone to passively feel like they are living according to their interior beliefs in a capitalist system by just consuming something which depicts resistance to capitalism, these sort of interpassive uh, pieces of media also absolve the subjects of capitalism of a sense of guilt. So there might be, if your interiority is one of anti-capitalism and your exteriority is one of absolutely supporting capitalism, then these sort of say in for example the anti-capitalist film you talked about, watching that might also provide some sort of sense of expiation of guilt.
It's very Catholic.
You've participated
Yeah,
in
yeah,
a
yeah.
disavowal of capitalism, and therefore you passively lighten that, I guess, psychological dissonance for a period of time until you watch another one of these films when it all gets too much. Yeah, I liked this idea of interpassivity a lot, and I do think it has descriptive
and especially
power.
when I guess I actually asked a buddy of mine about this because their perspective is often very anti-capitalist. I was like, yeah, but like you don't like if you really have such strong feelings, like you don't have to participate. Like, why don't you just like in the nth degree, there's monks who just go and they completely tap out and just go and watch their breath for 30 years. But there's people who like go and homestead, or there's go and live in the bush, learn how to hunt, live in the bush. Like, I don't know, like in Australia, like the national parks are so big, you actually could do that. And you could
just disappear. Like, it'd be a really hard life, but
there's
you
this
could
place
do
called
it.
the Walls of Jerusalem in Tasmania. Beautiful, amazing national, it's a state or national park, whatever. And there are actually it's absolutely gorgeous.
Remote.
It's like one of my favorite walks. Actually, I want to do it again before the weather gets bad. And apparently there are actually like a couple of people living in the Walls of Jerusalem somewhere, and you sometimes see, apparently people sometimes see them, and they fish and stuff, but they're just happy. Interestingly, funnily enough, in Tasmania, there's these random huts, like these, I guess they were put up by settlers or whatever, like European settlers. And so all over Tasmania, there's these random like old little huts that you can come across sometimes, and they're not necessarily all known, the locations are, but like Tasmanians who have lived here for ages, or their family, like, might know where the secret locations are. So some of these people find like these huts in these national parks, and they just like set up shop there and stuff. So my point to him was like, why don't you, if this is this actually like how much you dislike capitalism or whatever, like, why do you participate? And the response was, well, I don't really have a choice. Or at least, well, you do have a choice if you want access to all of the things that this civilization has to offer, like iPhones and stuff. Like, if you want access to that, yeah, you can't get in the bush, but it's a choice to participate. Like, you don't actually, at least in Australia, you don't have to. Just most people would rather not live in the bush. They'd participate in.
I guess the cost might be higher. So you could also say that this person's family and friends, like, presumably aren't going to follow him to Western Tasmania.
Yeah, and so there's social,
which is,
but there are people who,
so like, I guess there's that, but I guess there is exit. It's just the cost for most is
it's very high, and there are people who go and homestead, or like go to isn't the entire premise of like kibbutzes was like having these like little local economies where they're like pretty isolated and stuff. So people do it, and I guess what I'm just like pushing back against is that it's not just totally not your choice. Like, if you really like, people who take these ideas seriously actually go and do stuff about it, but if you want to like live in the middle of like Sydney and like have a nice apartment and like like a nice brand new car, and then just complain about capitalism and stuff, well, interpassivity is your way out of that bind.
Yeah, it is really interesting that Fisher says this combination of ironic distance, of cynicism and interpassivity is so much more powerful than any form of propaganda could ever be.
he was onto something here. This is very insightful.
Yeah. Yeah. The more anti-capitalist media you produce, the more you
So fucking
deepen
crazy.
capitalist
What a head
realism.
trip.
Because it just sucks in that protest and
What a
commodifies it
what a head trip. That is
and
such a
sells it
head
back
trip.
to you.
Hey. What about reflexive
Yeah.
impotence? Did you have any thoughts about? I can't really remember that concept, so maybe you have to.
Reflexive impotence, I think this is useful to discuss in comparison with he calls it liberal communism, or I guess being smart. So reflexive impotence is basically, he was using it to describe students and teachers operating within British further education, which when he worked in it was highly bureaucratized to the point where teachers couldn't really choose to do anything of their own volition. They had to teach according to standardized bureaucratic tools and were constantly subject to the nexus between auditing and PR, which we can talk about in when we talk about market Stalinism. Within this system of feeling that there's no alternative to this extremely restrictive bureaucracy on behalf of the teachers, and then on behalf of the students, feeling that there's no exit to a world where you're never going to be able to afford a house, you can barely afford food, where you're going to have a job you hate that you just don't feel like contributes anything to the world or to what you want to do, it doesn't pay you much. You feel extremely disempowered. And he calls this state reflexive, what was it? Reflexive impotence. So he says it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, hence the reflexivity, this belief that nothing can get better and there's no point. That if you truly believe that, if that is your model of the world, then nothing will get better. It can't possibly do that. And he says in Britain, many young people fall into reflexive impotence. And he compares this to French students. So British students mostly reflexively impotent. They're just totally passive. He compares this to French students who he says they're different but similarly unproductive if it comes to somehow escaping capitalism. He calls them immobilizers. So he says that they almost seek the aesthetics of protest, particularly the 1968 student protests. They seek those aesthetics and use the same slogans, dress in the same way, perform the same, I guess, movements of protest. So they march in the same way to the same places. But interestingly, it's to stop things from changing. So he referenced some. Let me have a look for it. Uh, Yeah, so he references the 2006 student protests in France, which were against a law that would have made it very easy to fire workers under 26 years of age within the first 2 years of their contract. Fisher calls the people who protest against the advance of capitalism while tacitly demonstrating their belief that capitalism can only be resisted but never overcome. That is, they're still within capitalist realism or still in its thrall. He calls them immobilizers. They want to just hold things in place. They're displaying this real conservatism of a conservatism and a deep pessimism of, okay, things are bad, but we just don't want them to become worse. So we're just going to hold it in place.
Stasis.
So that's
And
the
what's the
yeah
liberal?
passive reflexive impotence versus immobilizing. He also then actually contrasts this with a third current that he calls liberal communism. That he says people like Bill Gates or George Soros are exemplars of, people who rapaciously generate very large amounts of money, but then also espouse very socially liberal ideas and also espouse what he calls being smart. And he regards as an internalization of capitalist realism. So being smart in his telling is effectively being fungible. You're rootless, you're not tied to a place, you're not tied to a culture, you're not tied to a particular type of work, so you're flexible. I guess the learn to code is
Mm.
emblematic of this. When a truck driver loses their job, people say, "I'll learn to code." You should be flexible enough to absorb getting fired or changing careers regularly, moving for work, living weird hours, not being tied down by things like family, because that impairs your flexibility. It's a caricature of a type of person, but I can see elements of the caricature in certain
Jack's like
people.
in Levi.
He talks about certain young people, bragging about being motivated. So signing up to lots and lots of internships and multiple internships, subdividing their time in such a way as to maximize the output of each day.
A types,
A types. Sigma grind set.
That's really interesting. Do you think that is a sorry?
Yeah. So, no. I was just going to round that off by saying, those are these three types of people that he talks about: the immobilizers, the reflexively impotent, and people who are being smart. The liberal communists.
Really interesting. Some interesting people that he I just said like caricatures or whatever. Or maybe archetypes.
I guess maybe why they appear caricatures is, they're archetypal. So maybe no individual is going to fully conform to the archetype, but you have elements of these archetypes.
I think that's a good segue into the next concept, which is another really interesting thing that he, as a diagnostician, I've found very fruitful reading him. This idea of Fordism versus post-Fordism. And the first time that I'd heard of it, but I think comes from Deleuze or somebody else, this idea of like, it comes from Foucault, doesn't it? Like discipline versus control.
Discipline's Foucault.
Is Deleuze. So like maybe we could talk a little bit
Deleuze.
About discipline versus control societies and Fordism and post-Fordism. I can talk about the Fordism and post-Fordism. Maybe could you talk about discipline versus control societies? It's something I'm a little bit shakier on. Yeah.
And I want to preface this by saying this is my favorite bit of the book. The discipline and control and the market Stalinism.
You can give us what is a disciplined society and what's a control society, and what's the key distinction between the two, and which one do we live in under capitalist realism?
Oh, sure. So he says that there's been a shift, or the shift is underway, from a disciplined society to a control society. A disciplined society, he pulls from Foucault, and he says that these are top-down hierarchical societies, often based around some sort of enclosure. So he uses a factory as a prototypical example of a discipline relationship. And within a factory, you'll have the owner and the foreman as the owner's delegate controlling the workers. These workers are... Foucault, he elaborated a system or elucidated a system of particular positions that people take in these. So he says that disciplined societies, they exteriorly and from above impose discipline. So people in the factory will be sitting in certain rigid positions, performing a single action without talking or communicating, because those sort of things impair efficiency. They're just sitting at a production line, just performing this one job with exterior control or exterior discipline imposed upon them to make them work. And there are a lot of bad things about discipline societies. So they're stultifying, it's repetitive work, you're enclosed in what might be an unpleasant environment. You have a clear symbol of someone telling you what to do, or a clear hierarchy that you're at the bottom of. And he says that these correspond to Fordist modes of production. So Fordism, I'm assuming he's just referring to Henry Ford, who had a way of producing cars cheaply on a production line, where basically each worker on the production line did a job, and they were basically a standardized component. And it was meant to be horribly boring. Ford did pay his workers really, really well. So he tried... I doubt this was from the goodness of his heart and more just to make people tolerate extremely boring, repetitive labor, but he paid them a lot because he said, this is just what you need to do to make people behave like automata. But these were places which had a rigid top-down discipline imposed. And Fisher says that there were good elements. Like, the work was predictable and you tended to have the work for life. So those were good things, but he says the right used workers reasonable desires not to work at the same factory for 40 years, doing the same movement basically for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, against them in deregulating the labour market and making work highly unstable, imposing the need for flexibility upon people. And this deepened the transition to what he calls a control society. So a control society is very different from a disciplined society. A control society is cybernetic in the sense that it relies on a decentralized system of feedback loops to maintain integrity rather than a top-down command model. And so a control society becomes centerless very quickly. There's not one person at the top of it saying you are going to do this. Instead, it's this massively interlinked series of feedback loops, all maintaining each other's integrity and maintaining the integrity of an
So,
overall system.
so,
Yeah,
so is
we'll
it
go
like
into the details
control
of this.
societies top-down hierarchical, or is that's discipline? And
No,
control societies are
discipline. Discipline is top-down hierarchy.
as in like controls theory, like information-based feedback loops, like more distributed, that sort of
Yeah,
thing. Yeah.
yeah, and it's one in which the individual worker has internalized the discipline that used to be imposed from top down. They surveil themselves. I guess we can roll this into talking about market Stalinism here because this is a good example of a control society unfolding. So this is maybe my favorite term in the book because it's just very funny. Market Stalinism. He says that a key component of Stalinism under Stalin, so in the Soviet Union, was that it came to value representation or symbols more than whatever was underlying those symbols. So that is to say, they valued the appearance or the representation of meeting production targets above actually fulfilling whatever need those targets were put into place to alleviate. And he says that this is the same, or this is unleashed in a control society. So he uses the example of spreading bureaucracy in capitalist societies as an example of market Stalinism and as an example of control societies. So within a market Stalinist system, for example, the education system in the United Kingdom, he says that in his experience, you had the appearance of, how would I say it? In order to make the system regulate itself, they imposed all sorts of bureaucratic requirements. So initially, you had external auditing to make sure, ostensibly, the stated goal was to make sure that teachers or education providers were providing the education that was desired. He says, or Fisher says, that the point of auditing is actually just PR because the auditing doesn't change things meaningfully and it's not reacting to things that reflect the at least ostensible goals of, in this case, education, that is educating children. Instead, it actually boils down to how effectively each individual worker fulfills bureaucratic functions. So how effectively they fill out self-assessment reports, how well children do on standardized tests, which leads to the Stalinist emphasis on a representation above whatever is represented. So, in the case of standardized tests, teachers will only teach children to do the tests really, really well. That is, they are optimizing for the representation over the the stated goal of educating children well. And this is all to fulfill some PR, so such that an audit says that they are doing well, and on the basis of that, I think he says if no, so as not to confuse things, that's what market Stalinism is. So market Stalinism is the use of this decentralized cybernetic control system of auditing and PR to, I guess, there's no there's no stated goal of the existence of market Stalinism. It's this thing that no one particularly
Mm, mm.
wants when they're ensconced in it, but they can't seem to
Yeah,
escape
so I
from it.
think he did a good job of
This,
explaining what he means by actually using an example from Stalin, from like
yeah,
under the
that might be
Stalinist
clearer.
regime. Like Stalin wanted, was it a dam built or something like that?
The
Yeah,
White
something like
was it the
that.
White
And
Canal project or
basically, it was a
something?
huge waste of resources. A bunch of people died, and then it ended up not being used very much or something like that. Like it's basically a massive flop. But the people who came to it were basically like, journalists and stuff who are all paid off or like under the jurisdiction of the Stalinist propaganda machine. And they went and they just said, yeah, it's great. It's amazing. It's a huge success and all this sort of stuff. And so that they cared more like Stalin. And it wasn't just this project. Like apparently there was a bunch of these sorts of projects under Stalin where the actual consequence of the project, the dam, the canal, or whatever, was like either a massive waste of resources or actually like straight up disaster. But that never actually got
Mm.
spoken about. Instead, they cared more about the representation of this as being like a grand project that was a success, and especially when communicating that internally to their own citizens and then externally to the West. And now, yeah,
I guess importantly too, within that, what the people organising the project ultimately wanted from the project
yeah,
is
yeah,
that
yeah.
journalists would like it. Like that for them, the
Yeah,
representation
that's what
was
they're
the
going after.
object.
And analogously, he draws some parallels between, say, like the educational stuff. What is it? It's like where you just, as a teacher, you could just like, because your performance is going to be based on like what score your kids get in the NAPLAN, which is like this standardized test in Australia for
Or in
like,
Australia,
like
yeah, it's an
years,
app
year
plan.
10s or whatever. I don't know, whatever. And so you just optimize your
Mm.
teaching around like getting them to pass that test rather than actually caring about their learning.
Yeah,
And uh, he also uses the call center example. I think that was a market Stalinist example as well, was it? Or was that something slightly different? That was just bureaucracy in general.
that was talking about, yeah, very very related. I think the centralist bureaucracy, but that ties
Yeah,
in
yeah.
like that's
So
really
I
central in
found that
market
really
Stalinism. Yeah,
interesting. And because it's not a top down thing like in Stalinism, it's this diffuse. I suppose uh, he's saying
mm.
this emerges. Is he saying that this is essentially one of the things that happens under capitalist realism? Like people think, actually, we can't really question it. We're capitalist. We're capitalist society. We're being efficient. We're using objective measures. Like we're assessing performance and all this stuff. And then that sort of actually turns into this Frankenstein's monster of organizations across the economy. You have these like pockets of this market Stalinism.
I don't think he directly says that this centralist bureaucracy is necessarily.
Is it a feature
Mm.
of capitalist realism? Like it's a diagnosis?
So he certainly said that the arising of the excessive bureaucracy is a place where people who want to overcome capitalist realism could point to as a discrepancy between reality and the real. So the stated
Ah,
goal of
yeah, yeah, yeah,
capitalism to
yeah.
be more efficient and to reduce bureaucracy. But you then compare that to the reality of, oh, well, actually, there's way more bureaucracy than there was before. So there's that. I think whether he says it's a natural outcome of capitalism itself is less clear. He does say that the top-down nature of Stalin's rule was it entailed a disciplined society, which did restrain the emergence of this centralist bureaucracy, whereas capitalism has allowed that to deepen. It's allowed a control society to begin emerging, which lends itself very, very well to a centralist bureaucracy because all of the individual people within the bureaucracy have internalized this self surveillance of filling out, say, self audit forms. And because you never want to audit yourself as being better than what your, say, superior audits you as, you always understate your performance, which he compared to like a bureaucratic Maoist self-criticism session, which was extremely funny. But that sort of internalization and how you begin to, in the case of further education, teach with the goal in mind of fulfilling bureaucratic paperwork first, of representing your teaching well
Yeah, yeah,
over
yeah.
actually teaching well. He says that that arises or is allowed to flourish under capitalism without the constraint provided by top-down discipline under Stalinism. So I guess if he's not saying that this is a direct consequence of capitalism, he is saying that it constrains the emergence of a control society less than Bolshevism did.
Yeah. So
At least that was my
why
reading
did
of
you
it.
like this part, like the discipline control Ford, post Ford, and market style? Like, what is?
I liked it because it just seemed to describe this strange situation so well of how, at least on one hand, a lot of governments, at least in the Western world, will talk about how they're making things more efficient, how they're making things better. They like smaller states, while at the same time, just this spread of
Yeah, yeah.
bureaucracy has been so massive. And I consider a lot of it to be, even if it's not formally state, it is part of the state because it's mandated by the state and it's in large part implemented because the state wants it. So I view it as this strange semi-state outgrowth into
Yeah, that's really
so
interesting.
many
I
aspects of
hadn't thought of
society.
that, but that's yeah, that's a good point. It's kind of like it's well, if assuming it's coming from something like a regulatory framework, like
Mm.
even something like I was talking to an architect
Well,
about like just the process of building stuff, right? And he made an interesting point. He's like, yeah, we kind of like design according to regulation. Like we have to make sure, okay,
mm,
we can't just make corridors whatever size we want in a residential building. Like we have to have it.
mm, mm,
And there's arguments for and against it, like disability access and that sort of stuff. Sure, whatever. But it also just made me realize like, oh, okay, so like somebody's decision about that regulation in, like if it's a state regulation, like in the capital city, has now seeped into all of the buildings, like has physical consequences. It's like, so like their preferences, those political preferences, as well intentioned as they might be, actually like it seeps into our physical structures, like our built environment and stuff. Yeah, and obviously with regards to this stuff as well, if it's something like educational stuff, then it's like, okay, it was actually shaping the way that kids are learning and all that sort of stuff. It's really
yeah.
bit of a trip actually to think
What's
about.
what's even more unsettling? So what you were describing with regulations, it's at least that has some sort of locus of control. At least some group of people said, okay, these are the regulations that we're going to tell everyone they have to follow. What, like an example of a true control situation that Fisher cites is this particular time. I think he was part of some meeting between politicians, lecturers, and teachers within the further education system, bureaucrats who were implementing particular regulations upon the educational system to discuss the massive expansion of bureaucratic burden upon teachers, which teachers really weren't happy with because it's just taking away time that they could be using to teach people. And from my experiences in healthcare, like the administrative burden upon doctors is massive. Like so much time is spent filling out administrative things as opposed to seeing patients. It's certainly not limited to the United Kingdom. It's certainly not limited to education. But they were trying to work out where all of these new regulations or new requirements kept coming from. And politicians said, no, we're not coming up with these. Like, this is not coming from us. It's coming from somewhere else. Where it was coming from individual bureaucrats trying to interpret what they were meant to be doing. And on the basis of their interpretation of legislation and of regulations, were making their own regulations and imposing new bureaucratic burdens upon teachers on the basis of that interpretation. So it's a bureaucracy that is generating its own
Yeah,
bureaucratic burdens.
that's
And
Yeah.
that, like, when I heard of that, I thought, yeah, wow, this is
It's
actually
out of
just
control.
a runaway cybernetic system.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess part of the reason why I liked this part the most was from an aesthetic perspective, because I like that fear engendered by a runaway cybernetic system. It's just not under anyone's control. It's doing its own thing, independently of what any
Yeah, Jack
individual
likes
node within that system
the
wants.
fear. Likes a bit of fear when he's reading his social criticism. Yeah, very funny.
So there's definitely the aesthetic component from which I really like market Stalinism, but I also really like it in that it's attempting to describe something that is very real. Like, we have seen a huge expansion of bureaucratic surveillance and interference in increasingly more granular parts of work and life. And Fisher is trying to explain why this is happening, despite the fact that at least the exteriorly presented face of our politics is oftentimes, oh, we want to make things more efficient and reduce the burden and make things more agile. Swift and agile
We're
economy.
using design thinking to
10 out of
improve
10
our
political slogan.
education for our students. Yeah, it's all a bunch of bullshit. You definitely see this in the larger universities. So, okay, so it's really interesting. So, just a quick note, or like a quick side story. 2 seconds, and then I've got some follow-up questions to move along with. I was speaking to an accountant about his work, and he said that he works at like a large corporate, not like a local accountant office, but like a large corporate thing, and he works remotely from home. And the firm is introducing like surveillance technology onto the computers for that, so they'll track like all the apps. Yeah, so they track
a few of my friends
all your
have this.
apps, and when you log on, when you log off, all that sort of stuff. So,
Jack, have you been watching hentai for 14 hours a day?
that like furry vor. So it's like, okay, well, that's gross. I guess it's large corporate. What are you going to do? Like, if you don't like it, leave. But what was funny is that he goes, yeah, but what was really a really weird thing about it is that one of the quote unquote corporate values is like, we are a family or something like that. And he raised this to his manager. He says like, I went to my manager, what, like, we're supposed to be like like this company is a family or whatever, but families don't install surveillance technology on each other's. And his manager so what he said, just said his manager didn't say like, oh yeah, there's a real conflict there, like maybe we should reconsider. I'll like take this to the higher ups and reconsider like this policy of like mass surveillance. He goes,
mass surveillance.
Yeah, no, our language is a bit off there, isn't it?
I also just find something so grotesque about assigning designations like family to entities which cannot possibly be families. It's like,
yeah,
no, you're paying people to be here. This is not a family.
So
that is not something Fisher complains about.
Yeah.
And
so like, I had that interaction like this past week, and I just thought that was like so like on point with regards to this capitalist realism stuff, like this stuff that he's talking about. Like, this is just case in point. So there's another couple of concepts that you might want to put in the diagnostic section or whatever, but I don't know if they're as important or if they're as so that's the big other and dream, work, and memory. And I don't know if they're as strong concepts or if we can touch on them, but maybe they're not as strong. I can talk about the big other a bit. Dream, work, and memory, I thought that was the weakest chapter, but quite. And then we can move on to how to exit capitalist realism. So why don't you give us the big other? The big other. Some Jacques Lacan. So I guess this was another one of Fisher's attempts to describe, I guess, the problem of
why do people within a system cooperate with aspects of it that make them miserable? So Fisher says that in part it's because of the big other. So the big other is a Lacanian concept as opposed to the little other, or other spelt with a lowercase o as opposed to other spelt with an uppercase o. So the little other is how the ego views itself from outside, giving the impression of a harmonious unitary ego. And Lacan uses the image of one seeing oneself in a mirror and thereby viewing oneself as an object, not a subject. And it's an imaginary fiction of unity. As opposed to this, the big other, capital O other, is a symbolic fiction, and it operates through our language and social norms. It's this hypothetical other person, almost a perfect model citizen other who observes our behavior from without. And importantly, it's from without, and for whom we perform. It's linked to the little other because both of these others are viewing ourselves, our ego, as this harmonious unitary ego who is known from its exterior actions. So this big other, as it's not omniscient, is something to whom we present ourselves using exterior behavior, and we hide aspects of ourselves that we don't want the big other to know. These things that we think would be social taboos, for example. So as such, we present action that we want the big other to see. We want this model citizen who embodies all of the social norms to see by only acting out behaviors that we think they would like, because those are the only behaviors that the big other can see, because the big other can't see interiorly. We keep hidden things or thoughts that we don't want the big other to see by not acting them out. We keep them inside ourselves. And he concretizes, or he uses this concept of the big other in the case of Stalinism, of the Soviet or the market varieties, when everyone seems to know that the system's not working properly. If you asked someone in 1988, not under Stalin, but under Bolshevism, do you think this current system's working? And many of them, if they were to speak openly, would say, no, it's probably not working. But part of the reason why they don't say it openly, even though everyone seems to agree with them, or most seem to agree with them, is in part because they don't want the big other to learn that the system is not working properly. And he uses the example here of Gerald Ratner, a jeweler who had a chain of inexpensive jewelry stores. He described in an after-dinner speech the jewelry sold in his stores as crap. And this was the sort of thing where everyone probably knew that the jewelry wasn't bad, that you're not going to be buying really great jewelry for £10, but the big other in Fisher's telling wasn't aware that it was crap. But in attempting to circumvent the symbolic, Ratner wiped £500 million off the value of his company, and the company the company ended up going broke. Fisher says customers might previously have known that the jewellery Ratner's sold was poor quality, but the big other didn't know. As soon as it did, Ratner's collapsed. So this big other, I guess, is this invisible, diffuse figure who animates control societies. He animates bureaucracies because bureaucrats are constantly trying to optimize their behavior to please this big other, even though they might not individually agree with their behavior. Like I find this idea interesting. It's just a bit like when things get a bit too psychoanalytic, I think, yeah, you could be like other things could describe this too. Like, sure, the big other system might describe it, but other things could too. How did you find the big other being introduced? I didn't find it all that convincing. I hope I did a good job of conveying what the big and little other are. As I said at the start of this episode, I haven't had much contact with Lacan intentionally. And when I do come into contact with him, my avoidance of him seems like a good idea.
Yeah, so I'm gonna be honest. Like my brain switched off for this part of the book. It's just like I just started. My eyes were going over the words, but like it was like
Not
I don't know
absorbing it.
about this stuff. Like I already don't like psychoanalysis, let alone like
Yeah.
psychoanalysis with this. Like it's like psychosocial. It's just like I was like, yeah, okay, whatever. Like maybe like but it also just seems like unfalsifiable, just like like whatever. So yeah, I mean it's a fun
Yeah.
it's a fun thing to think about, but I don't put much weight in that. But good description, like well done. I believe you. Should we quickly mention dream work and memory
Yeah.
and then move on? Or I
Yeah, I didn't really like this. Do you want to go over it? 'Cause, like a lot of the dream work and memory thing didn't seem that specific to capitalism to me. Because a lot of it seemed to be him saying under capitalism, people's sense of events is so fractured that they can almost using dream work. So in a dream, you can have all these really discordant things happen one after the other. And at the time, it just seems perfectly natural because you just forget what was happening previously. It's only when you wake up and you remember the dream that you think, oh, that was really discordant. How could I have been conscious in that without seeing this discrepancy? And he says, under capitalism, we view things as dream work because of the discordance. He uses the example of I think Tony Blair and Gordon Brown being slimy, and it's like, yeah, but is this particular to capitalism? I mean, you think about the sort of people who want to exert power over others, namely people who go into politics. Has there been any point at which they were trustworthy on the whole?
mm,
Probably there's probably
mm,
not specific to capitalist realism. I guess that's cynicism. So I'm just expressing my complete ensconcement within capitalist realism when I say that. He also talks about I think the dream work required to hold in mind neoliberal and neoconservative positions. So neoliberal positions, he says, the ones that are quite desacralizing. So they're just explicitly amoral, just looking for markets. I would disagree with that characterization of neoliberalism because I think neoliberalism has a lot of moral assumptions built into it that even if its
mm.
practitioners don't
Yeah,
say
yeah,
that they're there, they're definitely there. Like even the thing of, oh, well, you should have liberal governments.
yeah,
That is a highly
yeah,
morally charged statement. Like that's very
yeah,
normative or morally normative. Just because some people don't say so doesn't mean that it doesn't carry with it like a bunch of ethical assumptions. So like I disagree with that characterization there, but for the purposes of conveying what Fisher's saying, we'll just assume that neoliberalism is completely amoral, just looking to make fat stacks anywhere you can. And he says somehow people believe in that, but also believe in neoconservatism, which is a much more explicitly moral um, worldview. It's like, let's fucking invade a
mm,
country
mm,
because they're not democratic enough. We'll base policy around church going Christianity, for example. Even with this, like the whole dream work thing might be more a reflection of Fisher being a very philosophically aware man, assuming that other people are similarly philosophically aware. So most people, I assume, who would be voting for a fusionist. I thought of this in the context of like Cold War fusionism, how you had an alliance between really, really militaristic people and people like militaristic people who were socially conservative with libertarians. And there was kind of this agreement of, okay, the libertarians can have the economy, the conservatives can have social matters. And that fusionist consensus held during the Cold War. It's fraying a bit now, but it held for a while. This neoliberalism plus neoconservatism thing reminded me of that, in that a lot of it at the heart, like at the political level, in terms of people negotiating with each other, it seemed to me of an alliance of people who have different beliefs but felt their interests coincided enough that they would cooperate on stuff, like with Reaganism or something like that being an example. then at the level of people who would vote for, in the case of Reaganism, like Republicans, most of them probably aren't thinking about this.
Yeah.
Like most of them probably aren't thinking, oh well, what are the philosophical implications of me supporting both neoliberalism and neoconservatism? It could be a few things. One, people might just not be thinking about it. Two, someone might like one of those things and say, oh well, this party, I might not agree with everything, but they've got, gee, I love that
That's what they say at the
neoliberal
voters. I
program
love
they've
that
got going, so I'll
neoliberal
ignore
policy.
the neoconservative aspects. God damn, I love neoliberalism. That is it. Direct quote of everyone who voted for Margaret
Yeah.
Thatcher.
So
Um, this bit felt weaker because it just felt like someone who's very philosophically aware trying to generalize that intense philosophical awareness to all of society.
yeah, I found this not compelling either, and and I think like there's
No.
also not necessarily anything unique. Like you could, and maybe that's a flaw with the argument. You could use the same exact arguments for any society with their dominant paradigm. So
Yeah, I didn't like this section much, and it was a stand up because I liked
and
basically every other chapter in this
that was
book
like
quite
the
a lot.
second last chapter or something like that.
Second last, yeah. Then you get to Marxist Super Nanny, where he talks about like how a Marxist version of Super Nanny would treat society, and then offers Spinoza as a really, really good model for understanding late capitalist morality. It is really funny.
Did you want
It's
to?
just
Do we
fantastic.
want to like touch on that, the Marxist super nanny stuff that you brought it up a little bit, and then the last thing to talk about is how to exit and how relevant is
Sure.
it? Yeah, so we're pretty close to done.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I get when he talks about Marxist super nanny. So okay. One of the things that capitalist realism does is it tries to privatize problems. So, okay,
Like mental health or something.
you're not getting paid enough, for example. Yeah, so in capitalist realism, it's your fault. A Marxist reading of things, Marxists will, as a general rule, look for structural problem or structural causes of problems. So, if an individual says, I don't have enough money, it's my fault under capitalist realism, a Marxist is more likely to say, okay, well, structurally, what are the reasons why this person is not, like, doesn't have enough money? They don't have enough resources to live, for example. Similarly, so to illustrate how a Marxist would approach these sort of problems in a systemic way, he uses the example of Super Nanny. I vaguely remember Super Nanny from when I was a kid. For those who are not old enough to be aware of the grandeur of Super Nanny, it's basically a reality TV program where you had fed up parents with ratty kids bring in the Super Nanny, who was a kind of like a prototypically strict British woman who would whip them into shape. And what Fisher is saying here is basically what capitalist realism would do to try to solve the problem of poorly behaved children would be to privatize their problems and to say, well, the children are just not behaving rationally enough. And Fisher says, with children, you just assume hedonic stupidity. Like, a 5-year-old is just going to run towards whatever is most sugary, whatever's the softest, whatever is making the loudest noises, whatever is the most brightly colored. I guess Fisher is also saying that is the consumer in capitalism as well. You just assume hedonic stupidity. In this part, he's saying basically that like capitalism conflates immediate individual desire with what people truly want, which is an interesting question to ask. It's just where I get off is the assumption that, or there's going to be someone who knows better than you who's going to be telling you like this is what you're going to be having. That's where I get a little bit more suspicious. So where the Marxist thing comes in. So in the context of Super Nanny is the Marxist. So Super Nanny is the one looking at the structure of the family and saying, well, structurally, you say not providing your children with sufficient discipline, which is why they're misbehaving. They don't know what they want. They need someone who structurally understands how things are working to impose a structure that makes them behave in a way that is good for them, good for their parents, makes everyone happy. So I found it very funny that he uses Super Nanny to describe the Marxist way of viewing things from a structural perspective. I found that
It's
very,
a weird
very
connection
fun,
to
highly
the
memorable.
super nanny.
That was really excellent.
Yeah, my only real comment about that is like, well, you see why like it becomes so totalitarian. Like if this is like you think it's a good solution to the problem is to go with Marxist super nanny for a society. Like, and of course, the people who are going to be in charge of like the super nanny apparatus are going to be the most devout Marxists, the ones who know it the best. Like, of course, you know, maybe it's Mark Fisher, and he like, so yeah. I mean, it was again like the later chapters I thought were weaker, but were kind of had some fun, some interesting things to think about. But so one thing I did want to touch on is that we mentioned many times in the conversation is the idea of like how to exit. So it's not super concrete, like it's fairly intellectual, but maybe we could just touch on that and explain.
It's very
reasoning.
Intellectual, and I viewed this as he was calling for a greater consideration of how to exit capitalist realism and was trying to start that process with this book. So I don't view it as a flaw that he didn't detail minutely how you would go about all of these things. He very much viewed it, this is a starting point for breaking capitalist realism. He had 3 places where you could bring capitalist realism into conflict with the real to try to break this totalizing
or something like like an illusion.
Because he said, as soon as you can crack it anywhere, as soon as you can provide any evidence that actually there are alternatives, then you break capitalist realism. That's because that's how you oppose it without being immediately commodified and sold back into capitalism, is by breaking the spell of capitalist realism. The first, he said, was ecological catastrophe. He says that capitalism's need for endless growth means that it inevitably leads to ecological degradation and environmental destruction, and that there is politicization happening around ecological matters, but most of it is actually, like everything else in capitalist realism, just becoming PR. It's becoming pure aesthetics that are just sold back to people. I should also add, when he says politicization, he means people organizing themselves into groups with the intention of effecting political change and hopefully overcoming capitalism. That's what he means when he says he wants to politicize an issue. He then also says mental illness is another place where capitalism can be brought into contact with the real. He says that capitalist modes of social relations, and especially late capitalism, just breeds particularly depression and anxiety. He says that these aren't individual problems. They're treated as individual problems because, on one hand, it absolves capitalism of any sort of responsibility for these mental diseases, but also it provides a market for the sale of pharmaceuticals to treat them. He makes a really interesting point. He says that, of course, all mental illnesses are physically instantiated. He's not saying that it's made up in some way. He's saying, yes, it is physically instantiated, but he says we're not actually looking at the social causes of why are these mental illnesses increasing in prevalence, which is a legitimate question. It's like it's not a given that human beings just suddenly all become miserable at greater and greater and greater rates. That there's probably a there.
And the final one was sorry, go on.
So he says,
I was just going to say the last one was
bureaucracy,
which we covered quite a lot. So the idea is like you
and for me the bureaucracy is one of the most compelling ones, actually.
So
it shouldn't be happening.
His idea of exit, I suppose, then is like at least the first part of it, even though he didn't give any concrete prescriptions about like what to do, or he didn't actually give like an alternative system. But I guess his first step is like to puncture a hole through this ideological spell with
because I guess the first step to that is you need to be able to conceive of an alternative system, and capitalist realism stops that happening. So you've got to break capitalist realism. And so if you take him within his framework, that makes a lot of sense.
Like his readers need to like break through that mental barrier. Um, did you find that idea of this like exit this exit idea interesting?
Very, very interesting. So in part, I find it cool because reading Nick Land is obsessed with exit, and so it's cool seeing other CCRU people
What
also
is it with this
carrying the torch for exit.
Just like the unit.
Not even Warwick University. It was just this
really into getting
particular
out of
group
it.
of fucking weirdos like Nick Land and Sadie Plant and Mark Fisher. So that was good. I do find it interesting thinking about are there, particularly with problems that I regard as, if not solved, but then really hard to see other engineering solutions to, like resource allocation, thinking about, okay, well, how am I blind here? What am I unable to see? And the call to overcome capitalist realism is in part a call to try to deal with that. And so I find it really interesting trying to think about my own blind spots. And so this naturally plays into that. Also, within his system, how he came up with solutions to capitalist realism, I find really interesting that he thought out a particular system and then tried to work out, okay, how do you break this thing that is so flexible and so capable of incorporating resistance to it into itself. I thought that was cool. The ecological stuff, I found the possible breaks of excessive bureaucracy and mental health the most compelling ones, because people just are more and more miserable. That does seem to be a real thing, and that is despite capitalism, or at least many in our society, saying, "Well, this is a system that fulfills your desires. You have so much choice to fulfill yourself with." And then the bureaucracy, as we've talked about a lot, is something that is stated. The stated goal, or a stated goal, is to reduce bureaucracy, and it just keeps appearing everywhere, and it's getting more and more invasive, and more personal, more and more demanding of affective change, as well as I guess procedural change. What about you? What did you think of this formulation?
Yeah,
of
I
exit?
guess. Yeah, taking his priors as a given about the importance of the real versus realities, I suppose. I can see where he's coming from in terms of like the need to
Yeah, you can see how he got there.
offer substantive criticisms that can't be subsumed by the same capitalist realist uh, like intellectual machinery that like consumes other things, like we were saying about interpassivity and stuff. Yeah, so I thought that was interesting. I guess to me it was also like, yeah, like that's fair enough, but also like it's highly academic. You know, it's like sometimes these academic things, it's like maybe you're pointing out some real issues, but like in terms of like this actual exit strategy, it's like, yes, sure, you need to break puncture like the illusion, lift the spell, but also like practically speaking, you know, most people aren't so intellectually oriented and like hang out with Nick Land and stuff, and they need something a little bit more than just like puncturing, like dispelling the illusion. They need like, okay, so how should we organize it? Like how should we solve these problems? You know, maybe he's just
Yeah.
You know, obviously that wasn't a part of his problem situation. He's much earlier except I think not at least like offering like one chapter in the book about like, okay, here are some thinkers that are like floating different things, or you know, to me I just felt like that was the practicality of it was really lacking, and I would have liked it. Maybe other people have picked up his thinking and like taken, okay, we've dispelled the illusion of capitalist realism. Now we're actually working on like concrete alternatives and stuff. But yeah, I would have liked to have seen him do that, because otherwise, without that, it just feels extremely academic.
Yeah. To that, I guess I probably have two comments. One is He did offer some concrete action. So he offered the idea of the bureaucratic strike, which I found really cool. So people turn up to work and continue and perform the tasks that they are ostensibly at work to perform, like teaching children, for example, or taking care of patients in a medical setting, but not completing the bureaucratic paperwork around them. I thought that was a cool idea and a really interesting idea for a strike to actually hamstring the bureaucratic apparatus that is making your job harder while also performing the job that you are actually paid to do, or at least notionally paid to do. So he had some practical things. In terms of the academic nature, I guess it's more just how I view social change happening. Social change seems to mostly happen when small groups of highly motivated people organize with each other. And in that case, like things like this probably could motivate that sort of cell, like a highly motivated cell, like say the Bolshevik Party. Like that they were tiny. Like they called themselves the big party, but they were still like very much occupying a minority position. But they were a small group of highly motivated people who had a high degree of ideological um, concordance with one another, who were
Yeah,
able to
and they were
affect a lot of
intransigent.
change.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, that's reasonable.
Yeah. So I guess like it could help nucleate a
Yeah.
highly effective small organized cell who could then go on to agitate and to inspire, say, people who are just less academically inclined and aren't going to read about the big other and go, oh yeah, that sounds good. That they might be able to make something that's more public facing than this, which is like while it is written to be digestible, it's still a book that heavily references like continental
Mm,
philosophy
mm,
and psychoanalysis. Like it's
mm,
accessible
mm, mm, mm.
within a niche.
So let's wrap it up. Let's wrap. This has been a big episode. Anybody who's
Let's
stuck
wrap it up.
around, whether or not it's
This has been a big one.
a double
We
double
haven't done
episode,
we
are we going
haven't
to cut
done
it in half?
a
We might have to
monster
cut this
episode
in
like
half,
this for a
publish it in two
while.
parts or something. We'll see. Anyways, if you stuck around to the end of the
I don't
conversation,
know.
thank you. Just
3.5
what's
hours,
our
I
cut
reckon,
off?
is
Like a
single episode.
4 hour. We'll cut it in two. All right. So I've got three closing
Yeah,
questions
maybe,
there. If you
yeah.
want to look in the notes, I've got the closing question there. But like, first closing question:
Let's have a look.
how is capitalist realism still relevant today? And if so, to what degree and why?
I think it's still the things he brought up in this are still very relevant. There's probably less a feeling of stultification as there culturally as there was probably in like 2010 to 2015 or something like that. Like it does feel like more things are moving. Maybe just because of this podcast, I've come into contact with some of these like alternative schools of thought more than I had in the past. So it might also just be a measurement problem. But to me, it feels like particularly the hard right is organizing, is intellectually trying to form alternative structures to at least liberal capitalism, if not capitalism fundamentally. So I can see groups of people trying to come up with alternatives. I feel like much of the left has because it's become highly establishment, at least in the West. The that sanctimonious left is just much less anti-capitalist. So I guess in that sense too, capitalist realism is still relevant in that you can still see notional anti-capitalism actually being highly establishment and reinforcing capitalism. In terms of the bureaucracy he brings up, that has just gotten worse. So that point of distinction between reality and the real is still there for the taking. Mental illness has just gotten worse. In terms of the environment, I feel like there's a lot more PR and advertising dedicated to it. So I guess that's in his paradigm, that's capital
really
realism,
greenwashing.
capitalist realism
Yeah,
at
it
work.
really is. Hey,
It's undermining that. Yeah, yeah. So I think it's still relevant. How about you?
I think so. Like, at least the parts of the book that we focused on. Maybe not the stuff to.
Yeah. And I guess also, like, to preface this, sorry for cutting you off, like within his paradigm, particularly, like if you take his paradigm as true, then it's still very relevant.
Yeah. So I'd say the specific things he talks about still seem to be persistent. And I see those things that like into passivity, cynicism, and all that sort of stuff. Sure, I guess it depends whether or not you think like this capitalist realism ideological cage that we're in, from his point of view, whether or not that's actually a thing. And because obviously, if it is a thing, then it's still relevant. Maybe even it's gone worse potentially. And yeah. So, but I guess like to me, it sort of hinges on like, yeah, there's an ideological component which is important to talk about. But there, as I said before, there are actually like pretty practical things that need to take into consideration, and like just dismissing them as quote unquote capitalist realism doesn't deal with the concrete issues of like distributing resources and stuff like that. So yeah, like that's pretty important.
Yes. Yeah. So it really is like, for me, where I struggle, and this is like, I guess he'd call this capitalist realism. Like for me, I guess where you would identify in me capitalist realism is I can't see a way around limited resources with alternate uses need distribution. And when he talks about particularly like the need to rediscover a general will and to rule for the general will, that's when I just say like, I'm out. I'm done.
So I guess that brings us on to
okay
question two, closing question two, which is closing thoughts and reflections.
Yeah.
Do you want me to go? Yeah.
Closing thoughts and reflections. So I really liked this book. I think it's well written, very clear. He manages to make discussions of
like accessible,
Lacan and stuff like that clear, which is accessible, which is impressive. He's a good diagnostician. Whether I think, I'm still not sure. And again, this is in part because I don't know whether it's an unfalsifiable claim, but the claim that basically, if I were to be uncharitable, if you disagree with me, it's because you're part of capitalist realism, and if you agree with me,
like
it's
class interest, or that
you've
sort of
seen
argument.
past it.
Yeah,
is very, very hard, if not impossible, to argue against.
And it doesn't take your opponent seriously. Like it doesn't. Yeah,
yeah. And it's like I'll be charitable to Fisher because he seemed like, I liked his book. He seems to be actually trying to solve problems. Like he doesn't seem malicious. So I'll assume he's not trying to be completely intransigent like that. But it's still, for me, resource allocation is an inescapable problem. And at least his hints at solutions of needing to distribute according to a general will, I'm highly, highly suspicious of. And even the claim that any of my criticism, because my criticisms are coming from the perspective of someone who's much more amenable to capitalism than Fisher was, that the ability to just dismiss that as saying, oh, you're in the thrall of capitalist realism because you disagree, I do dislike even accepting that it might be a real thing, and that like I might just be able to not see it. I might be blind to it. It's a very interesting book, highly thought-provoking. Definitely in his role as diagnostician, he's strong. I think he definitely picks up on some real things. In his role as someone setting out tactics or some sort of strategy as to what to do, I think it's really interesting. And I think within the context of his system, what he says you should do makes a lot of sense. I guess I'm still thinking through to what extent I think capitalist realism is totalizing as he says it is.
I think it's a great.
What about you?
Like a great framework, or like a mental model. As I said before, like don't necessarily have to agree with it in its entirety, and like some of the the givens of like the Marxist theory of equivalence values and that sort of stuff, which is there in the background. And there's criticisms of Lacan and that sort of psychoanalysis. Like there's a bunch of baggage that comes along with his point of view, and he kind of he kind of assumes that his audience are familiar with those ideas, and so it's not really like it's accessible enough that like if you're a motivated reader like us, like given that I haven't read Lacan and those sorts of people, that I had to just take some time away from the book, look at some concepts, see if like, okay, I kind of see what he's talking about. So it does feel like there's a bit of like an in group thing happening with his writing. Maybe not as much as other authors, but there's still a bit of that. But that's fine, whatever. But in terms of like the core thesis, it's thought provoking, and I think actually like it was a worthwhile read. And as somebody who likes a lot of the benefits of technological capitalism and entrepreneurship and innovation, that sort of stuff and whatnot, it's a nice countermeasure to just like getting, gung-ho about, technological acceleration or whatever, or like thinking that like the appropriate way to solve a particular problem is to have like a business ontology or something. Like now I've got these ideas in my head where I can like, okay, like check myself. Is that really like the best way? Like, does it have to be like that? So yes, from that point of view, very thought provoking.
Yeah, I'd highly recommend this book. I think this is really worth reading.
Last question: anyone. Would we recommend it? I'd recommend it. I recommend it to
definitely.
Probably like any of our listeners who are interested in like economics and libertarianism and that sort of stuff. We've got a few ANCAPs and whatnot. Give it a read. Like it's an interesting, thought-provoking thing. And yeah, like something that like, like say like I never see libertarians thinking through some of these issues, and maybe they've got a pre-baked solution to all of his problems that he's noted. But yeah, I would recommend it still. All right,
nice.
Marathon episode.
All right, that's all.
I wonder if our listeners are as tired
3 hours
as us.
and 40 minutes.
I hope you're not. Thanks for listening.
Yeah, I'm
thanks for listening. Next week we have something.
Thank you for listening.
Intense.
It's a good way to spend a Sunday afternoon.
Day, sorry. We have something about like something funny and not so.
We've done
grueling. All right. We've got stupid stuff.
Yeah, we've got stupid stuff coming up. We've got plenty of stupid stuff.
Right. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening. See you next time.